Baby Polar Bear and the Walrus by C.E. Kilbourne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Baby Polar Bear and the Walrus. Up by the North Pole, where it is dark all winter and light all summer, lived a polar bear family. When the baby polar bear came to them, the papa polar bear dug a cave in the side of a big piece of ice for them to live in. It was cold, but polar bears have such thick white fur that they cannot get very cold so long as they keep dry. The cave was beautiful because the light would shine through the ice and make all kinds of colors, yellow and green and red and blue. Here the mama bear and the baby bear rested and played while the papa bear went out to hunt fish for them to eat. He would go down to the edge of the water, which was all covered with ice except where there were holes, and sit by the hour till a fish came up to one of these holes. Then with a sweep of his big paw he would throw the fish out onto the ice. Then he would carry him home to his family. The baby polar bear got so very fat and strong and soon learned to play. His favorite game was sliding on the ice. "Just you watch me, Papa," he would say. Then he would climb up beside the door of the cave as high as he dared, sticking his sharp claws in so as not to slip. When he got up pretty high, he would turn around, sit down, and away he would go, laughing. One day he coaxed his papa up to slide with him. He was a regular little scamp of a polar bear, and had made a big snowball which he was hiding behind him. When the papa bear got halfway up, the baby bear let the big snowball loose. "Look out, Papa!" he yelled. The papa bear looked up and saw the big snowball coming. He tried to dodge, but his feet slipped and he came down bang on his stomach. Away he slid down that slippery slide, clawing and laughing, and just as he got to the bottom, the big snowball caught him and broke. The snow went all over him. The mama bear and the baby bear laughed till their sides ached. The papa bear got up shaking the snow out of his eyes and sneezing. "You little scallywag, you," he said. "Just wait till I catch you and I'll wash your face in snow for that." "You will have to catch me first, Papa," said the baby bear. "Let's see you try," and he rolled another big snowball. Then the papa bear started up again, going very slowly this time and sticking his claws way into the ice so as not to slip back. The baby bear rolled the big snowball out and held it with one paw. He got to thinking how funny it was going to be. He laughed so hard that he forgot to hold on and slipped himself. This time the baby bear and the snowball hit the papa bear at the same time, and all three of them slid down together. When they got to the bottom, the baby bear jumped up first and ran away. After him went the papa bear. Now, of course, the papa bear could run the fastest, but he pretended he couldn't, so he let the baby bear dodge him and run back to the mama bear, who cuddled him in her arms. "My, we had lots of fun, Papa," said the baby bear. "Looks to me as if you had had most of the fun," said Papa Bear. "Here I am, all covered with snow. When a baby bear gets as frisky as you are, it is time he was learning how to hunt for himself." So the next day he took the baby bear out hunting. They went down to a hole in the ice and watched for fish. First the papa bear caught one just to show the baby bear how, and then he let the baby bear fish. It was the first time the baby bear had had his little paws in the water, and he didn't like it much. But after a long time he caught a fish and was very proud. Of course the baby bear wanted to fish all the time after that. While he was lying on his stomach next to the hole, he saw a big black thing coming up through the water. "Goodness, Papa," he said, "here comes a funny kind of fish." The papa bear looked and grabbed the baby bear away just in time. A great big walrus came up through the hole and snapped with his sharp teeth. It would have been bad for that baby bear if those teeth had caught him. "Walk, walk, walk," yelled that walrus. Then he hooked his sharp tusks on the edge of the ice and licked at them with his big pop eyes. "Shall I catch him, Papa?" asked the baby bear. "No, indeedy," said the papa bear. "He would pull you right down through that hole." "Can he catch us out here?" "No, he wouldn't dare. Bears can whip walruses when they get out of the water, and he knows it." "Can we fish any more?" asked the baby bear. "Not while he is here," answered the papa bear. "We might as well go home now." Now that old walrus had seen the fish lying on the ice, and he was just waiting till the papa bear went away to climb out and get them for his own dinner. When he saw the papa bear and the baby bear pick up the fish, he got very angry. "Walk, walk, walk," he yelled at them as far as he could see them. They told the mama bear about the bad old walrus, and then she told them how she used to fish before she had the papa bear to fish for her. "You know," she said, "walruses chase fish, and often the fish jump out through the ice holes to get away from them. Of course the walruses climb through after the fish, but they're very slow movers when they get out of the water. So I used to go down near the ice holes and wait till the fish jumped through. Then I would grab them before the walrus could climb out. They used to get very angry, but could only yell at me." The baby bear thought that was a fine way to fish, because he wouldn't have to get his paws wet. So he used to go down to the ice hole every day after that. He lay on the ice and watched. Sure enough, pretty soon, a fine big fish jumped out of the hole. The baby bear ran forward to get the fish, but the old walrus climbed through the hole and came running on his flippers. He snapped his teeth so hard and yelled, "Walk! Walk!" so loud that the baby bear was scared. The next day he made some hard snowballs and took them down with him. He sat on his hind legs and held a snowball ready in one of his front paws. By and by a fish jumped out, and the old walrus started out after him. The baby bear threw the snowball, and it hit the walrus right in the nose, so he ducked back in the hole mighty fast. Then the baby bear picked up the fish and started home. "Just wait till I catch you," that old walrus yelled at him. "You can't catch me," the baby bear called back. "Even my papa can't catch me." But warmer weather was coming, and those polar bears didn't know that the ice was getting softer down below. The old walrus lived under the water most of the time, and he did know that the ice was going to break up pretty soon. One day, while the baby bear was out on the ice, a big piece broke off and started to float away with him. He heard it crack and ran for the shore. When he got to the edge of the ice, it was already too far to jump, so he started to get in the water and swim. But just as he was about to jump off the ice, up came the old walrus. "Now I've got you," said the walrus. "I'll teach you not to throw snowballs at walruses." And he climbed out on that piece of ice with the baby bear. One part of the ice was higher than the rest, and the baby bear climbed up there. "Papa! Mama!" he called as loudly as he could. "Walk! Walk! Walk!" yelled the walrus, and he started after the baby bear. His flippers couldn't get a hold of the ice like the bear's claws, so he kept slipping back. When he found he couldn't get to the baby bear that way, he began to chop the ice away with his sharp tusks. "Mama! Papa!" cried the baby bear. "Come quick, please!" Now the papa bear was away from home, but the mama bear came out of the ice cave. She ran down to the shore as fast as she could. The old walrus looked around, but the snow was white, and the mama bear was white, and besides, walruses can't see very well anyhow, so he didn't see her coming. He kept on chopping at the ice with his tusks, and was getting nearer and nearer to the baby bear every minute. "When I get you," he said, "I'll not need any fish for a long time. Baby bears are very nice to eat." The mama bear jumped into the water. The old walrus heard the splash and looked around, but the mama bear was under the water and he couldn't see her. When she came to the top, he was working away at the ice again. She swam out very quietly and started to climb up on the ice behind the walrus. When he felt the ice tipping, he looked around, and there was the mama bear. It was his turn to be scared now. He knew if the mama bear ever got out on the ice, she could whip him. So he turned around on his flippers and started after the mama bear to knock her back into the water. The baby bear saw what was happening. He jumped down and grabbed the walrus's tail in his mouth and pulled back with all his might. Of course he couldn't hold a big walrus, but he kept him from getting to the edge of the ice before the mama bear got out. Then there was a terrible fight. The walrus snapped with his teeth and slapped around with his tail and flippers, but the mama bear spanked him well and then knocked him off into the water. My, but that walrus was angry. "Oh, Mama," said the baby, "I'm so glad you came." And he cuddled up to her, not minding it at all that she was so wet. But they were not done with that old walrus yet. He swam off and got a lot more walruses, and they all came back together. They began bumping that ice from underneath to break it up so the bears would be thrown into the water. They made the ice rock so that the bears had a hard time holding on. But as they were below, they didn't know which way they were pushing, and first thing the bears knew, the walruses had pushed the ice close to the shore. "Come on, baby," said the mama bear. "Make a big jump." They jumped as hard as they could, and the mama bear landed on the shore. The baby bear didn't jump quite far enough and went into the water. Splash! The walruses turned around when they heard the splash and tried to grab him, but the mama bear was too quick. She picked him out of the water with her mouth and carried him home while the walruses stuck their heads out and yelled, "Walk! Walk! Walk!" When they told the papa bear about it that night, he looked very serious and said, We cannot catch fish any more till next winter. The ice is too soft. Tomorrow I'll take our baby bear out and see if we can find some seal to eat." The baby bear loved to go out with his papa, so he was real glad that the fishing time had passed. He learned lots of things that bears have to know about. One was that most all animals are afraid of bears. The beautiful reindeer would run away when they saw the papa bear coming. The little Arctic foxes never came anywhere near them, though the baby bear tried to coax them to play with him. Even the packs of fierce wolves would scurry away howling at the mere sight of a full-grown polar bear. "Why are all these animals afraid of you, Papa?" asked the baby bear one day while they were out hunting. "It is because I am such a terrible fighter. Those wolves would run right after a reindeer, but they know if they ran after me I could whip all of them at once. When you get grown up, they will be afraid of you too, but till then, look out." One day, though, the papa bear had to hide. He and the baby bear were coming home, and they heard something barking. The papa bear crouched down in the snow at once and made the baby bear cuddle down beside him. "Are you afraid of those wolves that are barking, Papa?" asked the baby bear. "Those are not wolves," said the papa bear. "When you are older, you can tell the difference between a wolf bark and a dog bark. Where there are dogs, there are men." "Are bears afraid of men?" "Yes, indeed," said the papa bear. "All wild animals are afraid of men. Men can make fire." Those bears lay very quietly in the snow. Pretty soon the men came by. They had a lot of dogs hitched to a sled. The men could not see the bears in the snow because the bears' fur was white, just like the snow, but the dogs could smell them and kept barking and howling. "Now you know what men are like," said the papa bear. "You must hide when you see them, for they may carry you away." It was a long time before they found any seal, but one day when they were hunting, they came to a place where the seals came ashore. The bears were on the hill above the place, and there were a lot of seals down below. The papa bear ran down and grabbed one, and then he and the baby bear carried it home. After that they had plenty to eat, for when they got hungry, all they had to do was go to the seal place and catch a seal. The baby bear kept getting bigger and stronger all the time. One day when he was out playing by himself, he heard something behind a big rock crying. He crept around, and there was what he thought was a baby seal. "What are you crying for, little seal?" asked the baby bear. "I'm not a seal. I'm a baby walrus." "What are you doing here?" asked the baby bear. "I'm lost." And the baby walrus began to cry again. "Where do you live?" "I live down in the water with my papa, but today I came out to see what the land was like, and now I can't find my way home." "I wonder if your father is the walrus who used to try to eat me," said the baby bear. Then the baby walrus got real scared. "Oh, please, little bear, don't hurt me," he begged. "I won't hurt you," said the kind little bear. "Come on, I'll show you the way home." "But my flippers are so sore that I can't walk any more," said the baby walrus. "Then I'll carry you," said the baby bear. "My teeth are pretty sharp and may hurt you some, but I'll be as gentle as I can." So he picked up the baby walrus and carried him back to the water. The baby walrus was very heavy, but the baby bear tried, and by got him back to his home. That little walrus was very glad to slip into the water. "Thank you very much, little bear," he said. "I'll tell my papa he must be friends with you now." "I wish he would," said the baby bear. "We could catch lots of fish together when the ice comes again." He told his papa and mama about it that night, but they shook their heads. "Better be careful about walruses," they said. "Walruses and bears don't generally get to be good friends." Late that summer, the papa bear got real sick and couldn't go hunting for food anymore. The mama bear used to go out some, but she had to stay home most of the time to take care of the papa bear. Often the bear family was pretty hungry, and the baby bear began to get thin. One day he thought he would go to the seal place and catch a seal for his papa and mama. "I'm getting to be a big bear now," he said, "and I believe I could carry a little seal home." So he started off without saying anything to his papa and mama and trotted along to the seal place. He got up on top of the hill and then ran down just as he had seen his papa do. The seals saw him coming and ran away, for they thought at first it was a big polar bear. The baby bear could run faster than the seals and soon caught up with one. He grabbed him with his mouth and pulled him over, but the seal began to fight. The baby bear did his best, slapping the seal with his paws and pulling him with his mouth, but he wasn't strong enough to carry him away. So they rolled over and over on the ground. Meantime, the other seals saw it was only a baby bear, so they all turned around and came hurrying back. They got all round the baby bear and began hitting at him with their flippers and snapping at him with their teeth. Then he did have to fight hard. He stood up on his hind legs so as to make himself as big as he could. He growled and bit and slapped them as hard as he could with his paws, but they kept coming in closer and closer, and the baby bear began to get tired. He wanted to run away, but there were seals all around, so he couldn't. Then he heard something screaming, "Walk, walk, walk," and the seals began to hurry away. The baby bear turned around, and there stood that old walrus. Then the poor little baby bear began to cry. "Are you the little bear that hit me in the nose with snowballs?" asked the walrus. "Yes," said the baby bear. "Are you the little bear that used to run off with my fish?" asked the walrus. "Yes," said the baby bear, crying still harder. Then the old walrus began to smile. He reached out one flipper and put it on the baby bear's head, and he said, "Are you the baby bear that carried my baby walrus home the time he got lost?" And the baby bear said, "Yes, I helped the poor little walrus who was lost." "Then you needn't cry any more," said the old walrus. "I forgive you for throwing snowballs and taking my fish, and after this we'll be friends." "Will you make those seals leave me alone?" asked the baby bear. "Yes," said the walrus, and he turned round and snorted at the seals, so that they all waddled down to the water and jumped in. "What are you doing so far from home?" asked the old walrus. The baby bear told him how sick his papa was. "You go right home," said the walrus, "and when you get there, come down to the water, and I'll meet you there with some fish." Then the walrus went back to the water, and the baby bear ran home. When he got there, he went right down to the water, and sure enough, the old walrus was waiting for him with 2 nice fish. After that, every day till the papa bear got well, the old walrus would catch 2 or 3 fish for the baby bear. And the baby walrus used to come out of the water and play with the baby bear every day. Sometimes they would go in swimming together, and they all got to be very good friends. When the ice came on the water again, and the bears had to hunt fish at the holes, the walruses used to help them by driving the fish out. The bears would gather the fish together till there were enough, and then the walruses would climb out and they would eat their dinner together. That was how all the trouble between the bears and the walruses came to an end. And all because the baby bear had been kind to the poor little baby walrus when he was lost. End of Baby Polar Bear and the Walrus by Charles E. Kilbourne. Read by Elsie Selwyn.
How do you find this book? Any thoughts about the book or the author? Any suggestion for improvement? Please take a moment to share your thoughts in a comment. If you like it, share it with your friends who might enjoy it as well. Subscribe to keep in touch. Visit CompleteAudiobooks.com for more quality content.
The Cat Who Walked by Himself, from the Just So Stories by Rudyard Kipling. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Cat Who Walked by Himself. Hear and attend and listen, for this befell and behappened and became and was, O my best beloved, when the tame animals were wild. The dog was wild, and the horse was wild, and the cow was wild, and the sheep was wild, and the pig was wild as wild could be. And they walked in the wet wild woods by their wild lones. But the wildest of all the wild animals was the cat. He walked by himself, and all places were alike to him. Of course the man was wild too. He was dreadfully wild. He didn't even begin to be tame till he met the woman, and she told him that she did not like living in his wild ways. She picked out a nice dry cave, instead of a heap of wet leaves, to lie down in, and she strewed clean sand on the floor, and she lit a nice fire of wood at the back of the cave, and she hung a dried wild horse skin, tail down, across the opening of the cave, and she said, "Wipe your feet, dear, when you come in, and now we'll keep house." That night, best beloved, they ate wild sheep roasted on the hot stones and flavored with wild garlic and wild pepper, and wild duck stuffed with wild rice and wild fenugreek and wild coriander, and marrow bones of wild oxen and wild cherries and wild grenadillas. Then the man went to sleep in front of the fire, ever so happy, but the woman sat up, combing her hair. She took the bone of the shoulder of mutton, the big fat blade bone, and she looked at the wonderful marks on it, and she threw more wood on the fire, and she made a magic. She made the first singing magic in the world. Out in the wet wild woods, all the wild animals gathered together where they could see the light of the fire a long way off, and they wondered what it meant. Then Wild Horse stamped with his wild foot and said, "O my friends, and O my enemies, why have the man and the woman made that great light in that great cave, and what harm will it do us?" Wild Dog lifted up his wild nose and smelled the smell of roast mutton, and said, "I will go up and see and look and say, for I think it is good. Cat, come with me." "Nenny," said the cat, "I am the cat who walks by himself, and all places are alike to me. I will not come." "Then we can never be friends again," said Wild Dog, and he trotted off to the cave. But when he had gone a little way, the cat said to himself, "All places are alike to me. Why should I not go too, and see and look and come away at my own liking?" So he slipped after Wild Dog softly, very softly, and hid himself where he could hear everything. When Wild Dog reached the mouth of the cave, he lifted up the dried horse skin with his nose and sniffed the beautiful smell of the roast mutton. And the woman, looking at the blade bone, heard him and laughed and said, "Here comes the first wild thing out of the wild woods. What do you want?" Wild Dog said, "Oh, my enemy and wife of my enemy, what is this that smells so good in the wild woods?" Then the woman picked up a roasted mutton bone and threw it to Wild Dog and said, "Wild thing out of the wild woods, taste and try." Wild Dog gnawed the bone, and it was more delicious than anything he had ever tasted, and he said, "Oh, my enemy and wife of my enemy, give me another." The woman said, "Wild thing out of the wild woods, help my man to hunt through the day and guard this cave at night, and I will give you as many roast bones as you need." "Ah," said the cat, listening, "this is a very wise woman, but she is not so wise as I am." Wild Dog crawled into the cave and laid his head on the woman's lap and said, "Oh, my friend and wife of my friend, I will help your man to hunt through the day, and at night I will guard your cave." "Ah," said the cat, listening, "that is a very foolish dog." And he went back through the wet wild woods, waving his wild tail and walking by his wild lone. But he never told anybody. When the man waked up, he said, "What is Wild Dog doing here?" And the woman said, "His name is not Wild Dog any more, but the first friend, because he will be our friend for always and always and always. Take him with you when you go hunting." Next night, the woman cut great green armfuls of fresh grass from the water meadows and dried it before the fire so that it smelt like new-mown hay. And she sat at the mouth of the cave and plaited a halter out of horsehide. And she looked at the shoulder of mutton bone, at the big broad blade bone, and she made a magic. She made the second singing magic in the world. Out in the wild woods, all the wild animals wondered what had happened to Wild Dog, and at last Wild Horse stamped with his foot and said, "I will go and see and say why Wild Dog has not returned. Cat, come with me." "Nenny," said the cat, "I am the cat who walks by himself, and all places are alike to me. I will not come." But all the same, he followed Wild Horse softly, very softly and hid himself where he could hear everything. When the woman heard Wild Horse tripping and stumbling on his long mane, she laughed and said, "Here comes the second. Wild thing out of the wild woods, what do you want?" Wild Horse said, "Oh, my enemy and wife of my enemy, where is Wild Dog?" The woman laughed and picked up the blade bone and looked at it and said, "Wild thing out of the wild woods, you did not come here for Wild Dog, but for the sake of this good grass." And Wild Horse, tripping and stumbling on his long mane, said, "That is true. Give it me to eat." The woman said, "Wild thing out of the wild woods, bend your wild head and wear what I give you, and you shall eat the wonderful grass 3 times a day." "Ah," said the cat, listening, "this is a clever woman, but she is not so clever as I am." Wild Horse bent his wild head, and the woman slipped the plaited hide halter over it, and Wild Horse breathed on the woman's feet and said, "O my mistress and wife of my master, I will be your servant for the sake of the wonderful grass." "Ah," said the cat, listening, "that is a very foolish horse." And he went back through the wet wild woods, waving his wild tail and walking by his wild lone. But he never told anybody. When the man and the dog came back from hunting, the man said, "What is Wild Horse doing here?" And the woman said, "His name is not Wild Horse any more, but the first servant, because he will carry us from place to place for always and always and always. Ride on his back when you go hunting." Next day, holding her wild head high that her wild horns should not catch in the wild trees, Wild Cow came up to the cave, and Cat followed and hid himself just the same as before, and everything happened just the same as before, and the cat said the same things as before, and when Wild Cow had promised to give her milk to the woman every day in exchange for the wonderful grass, the cat went back through the wet wild woods, waving his wild tail and walking by his wild lone, just the same as before. But he never told anybody. And when the man and the horse and the dog came home from hunting and asked the same questions as before, the woman said, "Her name is not Wild Cow any more, but the giver of good food. She will give us the warm white milk for always and always and always, and I will take care of her while you and the first friend and the first servant go hunting." Next day, the cat waited to see if any other wild thing would go up to the cave. But no one moved in the wet wild woods, so the cat walked there by himself. And he saw the woman milking the cow, and he saw the light of the fire in the cave, and he smelt the smell of the warm white milk. Cat said, "O my enemy and wife of my enemy, where did Wild Cow go?" The woman laughed and said, "Wild thing out of the wild woods, go back to the woods again, for I have braided up my hair, and I have put away the magic blade bone, and we have no more need of either friends or servants in our cave." Cat said, "I am not a friend, and I am not a servant. I am the cat who walks by himself, and I wish to come into your cave." Woman said, "Then why did you not come with first friend on the first night?" Cat grew very angry and said, "Has Wild Dog told tales of me?" Then the woman laughed and said, "You are the cat who walks by himself, and all places are alike to you. You are neither a friend nor a servant. You have said it yourself. Go away and walk by yourself in all places alike." Then the cat pretended to be sorry and said, "Must I never come into the cave? Must I never sit by the warm fire? Must I never drink the warm white milk? You are very wise and very beautiful. You should not be cruel, even to a cat." Woman said, "I knew I was wise, but I did not know I was beautiful. So I will make a bargain with you. If I ever say one word in your praise, you may come into the cave. And if you say 2 words in my praise, said the cat. I never shall, said the woman. But if I say 2 words in your praise, you may sit by the fire in the cave. And if you say 3 words, said the cat. I never shall, said the woman. But if I say 3 words in your praise, you may drink the warm white milk 3 times a day, for always and always and always. Then the cat arched his back and said, Now let the curtain at the mouth of the cave, and the fire at the back of the cave, and the milk pots that stand beside the fire, remember what my enemy and the wife of my enemy has said. And he went away to the wet wild woods, waving his wild tail and walking by his wild lone. That night when the man and the horse and the dog came home from hunting, the woman did not tell them of the bargain that she had made with the cat, because she was afraid that they might not like it. Cat went far and far away and hid himself in the wet wild woods by his wild lone for a long time, till the woman forgot all about him. Only the bat, the little upside-down bat that hung inside the cave, knew where Cat hid, and every evening Bat would fly to Cat with news of what was happening. One evening Bat said, There is a baby in the cave. He is new and pink and fat and small, and the woman is very fond of him. Ah, said the cat, listening, but what is the baby fond of? He is fond of things that are soft and tickle, said the bat. He is fond of warm things to hold in his arms when he goes to sleep. He is fond of being played with. He is fond of all those things. Ah, said the cat, listening, then my time has come. Next night, Cat walked through the wet wild woods and hid very near the cave till morning time, and man and dog and horse went hunting. The woman was busy cooking that morning, and the baby cried and interrupted, so she carried him outside the cave and gave him a handful of pebbles to play with. But still the baby cried. Then the cat put out his patty paw and patted the baby on the cheek, and it cooed, and the cat rubbed against its fat knees and tickled it under its fat chin with his tail, and the baby laughed, and the woman heard him and smiled. Then the bat, the little upside-down bat that hung in the mouth of the cave, said, Oh, my hostess and wife of my host and mother of my host's son, a wild thing from the wild woods is most beautifully playing with your baby. A blessing on that wild thing, whoever he may be, said the woman, straightening her back, for I was a busy woman this morning, and he has done me a service. That very minute and second, best beloved, the dried horse-skin curtain that was stretched tail down at the mouth of the cave fell down, whoosh, because it remembered the bargain she had made with the cat. And when the woman went to pick it up, lo and behold, the cat was sitting quite comfy inside the cave. Oh, my enemy and wife of my enemy and mother of my enemy, said the cat, it is I. For you have spoken a word in my praise, and now I can sit within the cave for always and always and always. But still I am the cat who walks by himself, and all places are alike to me. The woman was very angry, and shut her lips tight, and took up her spinning wheel, and began to spin. But the baby cried, because the cat had gone away, and the woman could not hush it, for it struggled and kicked and grew black in the face. Oh, my enemy, and wife of my enemy, and mother of my enemy, said the cat, take a strand of the wire that you are spinning, and tie it to your spinning whorl, and drag it along the floor, and I will show you a magic that shall make your baby laugh as loudly as he is now crying. I will do so, said the woman, because I am at my wit's end, but I will not thank you for it. She tied the thread to the little clay spindle whorl, and drew it across the floor, and the cat ran after it, and patted it with its paws, and rolled head over heels, and tossed it backward over his shoulder, and chased it between his hind legs, and pretended to lose it, and pounced down upon it again, till the baby laughed as loudly as it had been crying, and scrambled after the cat, and frolicked all over the cave, till it grew tired, and settled down to sleep, with the cat in its arms. "Now," said the cat, "I will sing the baby a song that shall keep him asleep for an hour." And he began to purr, loud and low, low and loud, till the baby fell fast asleep. The woman smiled as she looked down upon the two of them and said, "That was wonderfully done. No question but you are very clever, O cat." That very minute and second, best beloved, the smoke of the fire at the back of the cave came down in clouds from the roof, poof, because it remembered the bargain she had made with the cat. And when it had cleared away, lo and behold, the cat was sitting quite comfy close to the fire. "Oh, my enemy, and wife of my enemy, and mother of my enemy," said the cat, "it is I. For you have spoken a second word in my praise, and now I can sit by the warm fire at the back of the cave for always and always and always. But still I am the cat who walks by himself, and all places are alike to me." Then the woman was very, very angry, and let down her hair and put more wood on the fire, and brought out the broad blade bone of the shoulder of mutton, and began to make a magic that should prevent her from saying a third word in praise of the cat. It was not a singing magic, best beloved. It was a still magic. And by, the cave grew so still that a little wee mouse crept out of a corner and ran across the floor. "Oh, my enemy, and wife of my enemy, and mother of my enemy," said the cat, "is that little mouse part of your magic?" "Oh, gee, no, indeed," said the woman, and she dropped the blade bone and jumped upon the footstool in front of the fire and braided up her hair very quick, for fear that the mouse should run up into it. "Ah," said the cat, watching, "then the mouse will do me no harm if I eat it." "No," said the woman, braiding up her hair, "eat it quickly, and I will ever be grateful to you." Cat made one jump and caught the little mouse, and the woman said, "100 thanks. Even the first friend is not quick enough to catch little mice as you have done. You must be very wise." That very moment and second, O best beloved, the milk pot that stood by the fire cracked in 2 pieces, because it remembered the bargain she had made with the cat. And when the woman jumped down from the footstool, lo and behold, the cat was lapping up the warm white milk that lay in one of the broken pieces. "Oh, my enemy, and wife of my enemy, and mother of my enemy," said the cat, "it is I. For you have spoken 3 words in my praise, and now I can drink the warm white milk 3 times a day, for always and always and always. But still I am the cat who walks by himself, and all places are alike to me." Then the woman laughed, and set the cat a bowl of warm white milk, and said, "O cat, you are as clever as a man, but remember that your bargain was not made with the man or the dog, and I do not know what they will do when they come home." "What is that to me?" said the cat. "If I have my place in the cave by the fire, and my warm white milk 3 times a day, I do not care what the man or the dog can do." That evening, when the man and the dog came into the cave, the woman told them all the story of the bargain, while the cat sat by the fire and smiled. Then the man said, "Yes, but he has not made a bargain with me, or with all proper men after me." Then he took off his 2 leather boots, and he took up his little stone axe, that makes 3, and he fetched a piece of wood and a hatchet, that is 5 altogether, and he set them out in a row, and said, "Now we will make our bargain. If you do not catch mice when you are in the cave, for always and always and always, I will throw these 5 things at you whenever I see you, and so shall all proper men do after me." "Ah," said the woman, listening, "this is a very clever cat, but he is not so clever as my man." The cat counted the 5 things, and they looked very knobby, and he said, "I will catch mice when I am in the cave, for always and always and always, but still I am the cat who walks by himself, and all places are alike to me." "Not when I am near," said the man. "If you had not said that last, I would have put all these things away for always and always and always. But I am now going to throw my 2 boots and my little stone axe, that makes 3, at you whenever I meet you, and so shall all proper men do after me." Then the dog said, "Wait a minute, he has not made a bargain with me, or with all proper dogs after me." And he showed his teeth and said, "If you are not kind to the baby while I am in the cave for always and always and always, I will hunt you till I catch you, and when I catch you, I will bite you, and so shall all proper dogs do after me." "Ah," said the woman, listening, "this is a very clever cat, but he is not so clever as the dog." Cat counted the dog's teeth, and they looked very pointed, and said, "I will be kind to the baby while I am in the cave, as long as he does not pull my tail too hard, for always and always and always. But still, I am the cat that walks by himself, and all places are alike to me." "Not when I am near," said the dog. "If you had not said that last, I would have shut my mouth for always and always and always, but now I am going to hunt you up a tree whenever I meet you, and so shall all proper dogs do after me." Then the man threw his 2 boots and his little stone axe, that makes 3, at the cat, and the cat ran out of the cave, and the dog chased him up a tree, and from that day to this, best beloved, 3 proper men out of 5 will always throw things at a cat whenever they meet him, and all proper dogs will chase him up a tree. But the cat keeps his side of the bargain too. He will kill mice, and he will be kind to babies when he is in the house, just as long as they do not pull his tail too hard. But when he has done that, and between times, and when the moon gets up and night comes, he is the cat that walks by himself, and all places are alike to him. Then he goes out to the wet wild woods, or up the wet wild trees, or on the wet wild roofs, waving his wild tail and walking by his wild lone. End of The Cat Who Walked by Himself, from the Just So Stories by Rudyard Kipling. Read by Linda Sonrisa Jones.
Christmas in Red Butte by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Tom Merritt. Christmas at Red Butte. "Of course Santa Claus will come," said Jimmy Martin confidently. Jimmy was 10, and at 10 it is easy to be confident. Why, he's got to come because it's Christmas Eve. And he always has come. You know that, twins. Yes, the twins knew it, and, cheered by Jimmy's superior wisdom, their doubts passed away. There had been one terrible moment when Theodora had sighed and told them they mustn't be too disappointed if Santa Claus did not come this year, because the crops had been poor, and he mightn't have had enough presents to go around. "That doesn't make any difference to Santa Claus," scoffed Jimmy. "You know as well as I do, Theodora Prentice, that Santa Claus is rich, whether the crops fail or not. They failed 3 years ago, before Father died, but Santa Claus came all the same. Probably you don't remember it, twins, 'cause you were too little, but I do. Of course he'll come, so don't you worry a mite. And he'll bring my skates and your dolls. He knows we're expecting them, Theodora, 'cause we wrote him a letter last week and threw it up the chimney. And there'll be candy and nuts, of course, and Mother's gone to town to buy a turkey. I tell you, we're going to have a ripping Christmas." "Well, don't use such slangy words about it, Jimmy boy," sighed Theodora. She couldn't bear to dampen their hopes any further, and perhaps Aunt Elizabeth might manage it if the colt sold well. But Theodora had her painful doubts, and she sighed again as she looked out of the window, far down the trail that wound across the prairie, red-lighted by the declining sun of the short wintry afternoon. "Do people always sigh like that when they get to be 16? Asked Jimmy curiously. "You didn't sigh like that when you were only 15, Theodora. I wish you wouldn't. It makes me feel funny. And it's not a nice kind of funniness either. It's a bad habit I've got into lately," said Theodora, trying to laugh. "Old folks are dull sometimes, you know, Jimmy boy." 16 is awful old, isn't it? Said Jimmy reflectively. "I'll tell you what I'm going to do when I'm 16, Theodora. I'm going to pay off the mortgage and buy Mother a silk dress and a piano for the twins. Won't that be elegant? I'll be able to do that 'cause I'm a man. Of course, if I was only a girl, I couldn't. I hope you'll be a good, kind, brave man and a real help to your mother," said Theodora softly, sitting down before the cozy fire and lifting the fat little twins into her lap. "Oh, I'll be good to her, never you fear," assured Jimmy, squatting comfortably down on the little fur rug before the stove, the skin of the coyote his father had killed 4 years ago. "I believe in being good to your mother when you've only got the one. Now tell us a story, Theodora, a real jolly story, you know, with lots of fighting in it. Only please don't kill anybody. I like to hear about fighting, but I like to have all the people come out alive." Theodora laughed and began a story about the real rebellion of '85, a story which had the double merit of being true and exciting at the same time. It was quite dark when she finished, and the twins were nodding, but Jimmy's eyes were wide open and sparkling. "That was great," he said, drawing a long breath. "Tell us another." "No, it's bedtime for you all," said Theodora firmly. "One story at a time is my rule, you know." "But I want to sit up till Mother comes back," objected Jimmy. "You can't. She may be very late, for she would have to wait to see Mr. Porter. Besides, you don't know what time Santa Claus might come, if he comes at all. If he were to drive along and see you children up instead of being sound asleep in bed, he might go right on and never call at all." This argument was too much for Jimmy. "All right, we'll go, but we have to hang up our stockings first. Twins, get yours." The twins toddled off in great excitement and brought back their Sunday stockings, which Jimmy proceeded to hang along the edge of the mantel shelf. This done, they all trooped obediently off to bed. Theodora gave another sigh and seated herself at the window, where she could watch the moonlit prairie for Mrs. Martin's homecoming and knit at the same time. I am afraid that you will think from all the sighing Theodora was doing that she was a very melancholy and despondent young lady. You couldn't think anything more unlike the real Theodora. She was the jolliest, bravest girl of 16 in all Saskatchewan, as her shining brown eyes and rosy dimpled cheeks would have told you. And her sighs were not on her own account, but simply for fear the children were going to be disappointed. She knew that they would be almost heartbroken if Santa Claus did not come, and that this would hurt the patient, hard-working little mother more than all else. 5 years before this, Theodora had come to live with Uncle George and Aunt Elizabeth in the little log house at Red Butte. Her own mother had just died, and Theodora had only her big brother Donald left, and Donald had Klondike fever. The Martins were poor, but they had gladly made room for their little niece, and Theodora had lived there ever since, her aunt's right-hand girl, and the beloved playmate of the children. They had been very happy until Uncle George's death 2 years before this Christmas Eve. But since then, there had been hard times in the little log house, and though Mrs. Martin and Theodora did their best, it was a woefully hard task to make both ends meet, especially this year when their crops had been poor. Theodora and her aunt had made every sacrifice possible for the children's sake, and at least Jimmy and the twins had not felt the pinch very severely yet. At 7, Mrs. Martin's bells jingled at the door, and Theodora flew off. "Go right in and get warm, Auntie," she said briskly. "I'll take Ned away and unharness him." "It's a bitterly cold night," said Mrs. Martin wearily. There was a note of discouragement in her voice that struck dismay to Theodora's heart. "I'm afraid it means no Christmas for the children tomorrow," she thought sadly, as she led Ned away to the stable. When she returned to the kitchen, Mrs. Martin was sitting by the fire, her face in her chilled hand, sobbing convulsively. "Auntie, oh, Auntie, don't!" exclaimed Theodora impulsively. It was such a rare thing to see her plucky, resolute little aunt in tears. "You're cold and tired. I'll have a nice cup of tea for you in a trice." "No, it isn't that," said Mrs. Martin brokenly. "It was seeing those stockings hanging there. Theodora, I couldn't get a thing for the children, not a single thing. Mr. Porter would only give $40 for the coat, and when all the bills were paid, there was barely enough left for such necessaries as we must have. I suppose I ought to feel thankful I could get those, but the thought of the children's disappointment tomorrow is more than I can bear. It would have been better to have told them long ago, but I kept building on getting more for the coat. Well, it's weak and foolish to give way like this. We'd better both take a cup of tea and go to bed. It will save fuel." When Theodora went up to her room, her face was very thoughtful. She took a small box from her table and carried it to the window. In it was a very pretty little gold locket hung on a narrow blue ribbon. Theodora held it tenderly in her fingers and looked out over the moonlit prairie with a very sober face. Could she give up her dear locket? The locket Donald had given her just before he started for the Klondike? She had never thought she could do such a thing. It was almost the only thing she had to remind her of Donald. Handsome, merry, impulsive, warm-hearted Donald, who had gone away 4 years ago with a smile on his bonny face and splendid hope in his heart. "Here's a locket for you, gift of God," he had said gaily. He had such a dear, loving habit of calling her by the beautiful meaning of her name. A lump came into Theodora's throat as she remembered it. "I couldn't afford a chain, too, but when I come back, I'll bring you a rope of Klondike nuggets for it." Then he had gone away. For 2 years letters had come from him regularly. Then he wrote that he had joined a prospecting party to a remote wilderness. After that was silence, deepening into anguish of suspense that finally ended in hopelessness. A rumor came that Donald Prentice was dead. None had returned from the expedition he had joined. Theodora had long given up all hope of ever seeing Donald again. Hence her locket was doubly dear to her. But Aunt Elizabeth had always been so good and loving and kind to her. Could she not make the sacrifice for her sake? Yes, she could and would. Theodora flung up her head with a gesture that meant decision. She took out of the locket the bits of hair, her mother's and Donald's, which it contained. Perhaps a tear or two fell as she did so, and then hastily donned her warmest cap and wraps. It was only 3 miles to Spencer. She could easily walk it in an hour, and, as it was Christmas Eve, the shops would be open late. She must walk, for Ned could not be taken out again, and the mare's foot was sore. Besides, Aunt Elizabeth must not know until it was done. As stealthily as if she were bound on some nefarious errand, Theodora slipped downstairs and out of the house. The next minute she was hurrying along the trail in the moonlight. The great dazzling prairie was around her, the mystery and splendor of the northern night all about her. It was very calm and cold, but Theodora walked so briskly that she kept warm. The trail from Red Butte to Spencer was a lonely one. Mr. Lurgan's house, halfway to town, was the only dwelling on it. When Theodora reached Spencer, she made her way at once to the only jewelry store the little town contained. Mr. Benson, its owner, had been a friend of her uncle's, and Theodora felt sure he would buy her locket. Nevertheless, her heart beat quickly, and her breath came and went uncomfortably fast as she went in. Suppose he wouldn't buy it. Then there would be no Christmas for the children at Red Butte. "Good evening, Miss Theodora," said Mr. Benson briskly. "What can I do for you?" "I'm afraid I'm not a very welcome sort of customer, Mr. Benson," said Theodora, with an uncertain smile. "I want to sell, not buy. Will you buy this locket?" Mr. Benson pursed his lips, took up the locket, and examined it. "Well, I don't often buy second-hand stuff," he said, after some reflection. "But I don't mind obliging you, Miss Theodora. I'll give you $4 for this trinket." Theodora knew the locket had cost a great deal more than that, but $4 would get what she wanted, and she dared not ask for more. In a few minutes the locket was in Mr. Benson's possession, and Theodora, with 4 crisp new bills in her purse, was hurrying to the toy store. Half an hour later she was on her way back to Red Butte, with as many parcels as she could carry. Jimmy skates, 2 lovely dolls for the twins, packages of nuts and candy, and a nice plump turkey. Theodora beguiled her lonely tramp by picturing the children's joy in the morning. About a quarter of a mile past Mr. Lurgan's house, the trail curved suddenly above a bluff of poplars. As Theodora rounded the turn, she halted in amazement. Almost at her feet, the body of a man was lying across the road. He was clad in a big fur coat and had a fur cap pulled well down over his forehead and ears. Almost all of him that could be seen was a full bushy beard. Theodora had no idea who he was or where he had come from, but she realized that he was unconscious and that he would speedily freeze to death if help were not brought. The footprints of a horse galloping across the prairie suggested a fall and a runaway, but Theodora did not waste time in speculation. She ran back at full speed to Mr. Lurgan's and roused the household. In a few minutes Mr. Lurgan and his son had hitched a horse to a wood sleigh and hurried down the trail to the unfortunate man. Theodora, knowing that her assistance was not needed and that she ought to get home as quickly as possible, went on her way as soon as she had seen the stranger in safe keeping. When she reached the little log house, she crept in, cautiously put the children's gifts in their stockings, placed the turkey on the table where Aunt Elizabeth would see it the first thing in the morning, and then slipped off to bed. A very weary, but very happy girl. The joy that reigned in the little log house the next day more than repaid Theodora for her sacrifice. "Whoopee! Didn't I tell you that Santa Claus would come all right?" shouted the delighted Jimmy. "Oh, what splendid skates!" The twins hugged their dolls in silent rapture, but Aunt Elizabeth's face was the best of all. Then the dinner had to be prepared, and everybody had a hand in that. Just as Theodora, after a grave peep into the oven, had announced that the turkey was done, a sleigh dashed around the house. Theodora flew to answer the knock at the door, but there stood Mr. Lurgan, and a big, bewhiskered, fur-coated fellow, whom Theodora recognized as the stranger she had found on the trail. But was he a stranger? There was something oddly familiar in those merry brown eyes. Theodora felt herself growing dizzy. "Donald!" she gasped. "Oh, Donald!" And then she was in the big fellow's arms, laughing and crying at the same time. Donald it was indeed. And then followed half an hour during which everybody talked at once, and the turkey would have been burned to a crisp had it not been for the presence of mind of Mr. Lurgan, who, being the least excited of them all, took it out of the oven and set it on the back of the stove. "To think that it was you last night, and that I never dreamed it!" exclaimed Theodora. "Oh, Donald, if I hadn't gone to town—" "I'd have frozen to death, I'm afraid," said Donald soberly. "I got into Spencer on the last train last night. I felt that I must come right out. I couldn't wait till morning, but there wasn't a team to be got for love or money. It was Christmas Eve, and all the livery rigs were out, so I came on horseback. Just by that bluff, something frightened my horse, and he shied violently. I was half asleep and thinking of my little sister, and I went off like a shot. I suppose I struck my head against a tree. Anyway, I knew nothing more until I came to in Mr. Lurgan's kitchen. I wasn't much hurt, feel none the worst of it, except for a sore head and shoulder. But, oh, gift of God, how you have grown! I can't realize that you are the little sister I left 4 years ago. I suppose you have been thinking I was dead." "Yes, and oh, Donald, where have you been?" "Well, I went way up north with a prospecting party. We had a tough time the first year, I can tell you, and some of us never came back. We weren't in a country where post offices were lying around loose either, you see. Then at last, just as we were about giving up in despair, we struck it rich. I've brought a snug little pile home with me, and things are going to look up in this log house, gift of God. There'll be no more worrying for you dear people over mortgages." "I'm so glad for Auntie's sake," said Theodora, with shining eyes. "But, oh, Donald, it's best of all just to have you back. I'm so perfectly happy I don't know what to do or say." "Well, I think you might have dinner," said Jimmy in an injured tone. "The turkey's getting stone cold, and I'm most starving. I just can't stand it another minute." So with a laugh they all sat down at the table and ate the merriest Christmas dinner the little log house had ever seen. End of Christmas in Red Butte by Lucy Maud Montgomery.
Jessie's Dollar by Amanda Minnie Douglas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Elsie Selwyn. "There's something to buy sugar plums with," Uncle Mark said, with a goodbye to his little niece, Jessie. She kissed him and gave him a good, hard hug by way of showing her gratitude. After he had gone, she opened her hand and smoothed out the rumpled note. It was $1. Jessie Marsh was used to having considerable spending money. Uncles, aunts, and cousins kept her pretty well supplied. She was one of those bright, merry girls who are always smiling and happy, and a great favorite with everybody, ready to do a favor, hold a skein of yarn for grandmother, look up her papa's slippers, and run upstairs or downstairs for a misplaced or forgotten article. Perhaps this was why she received so many gifts of one kind and another, for even visitors at the house always went away with a pleasant remembrance of cheerful, obliging Jessie. Mr. Marsh was in very comfortable circumstances and extremely indulgent to his little daughter. She was the only girl, and there were 4 boys in the family. If Jessie expressed a wish for a book or a toy, he always brought it home to her. I am sorry to say that Jessie was rather careless and extravagant. To be sure, she made glad many a child's heart by gifts of her playthings when she was done with them, but she tired of them very soon and wanted something new. Pennies, quarters, and even $half often went for some trifle that presently lost interest for her. Mrs. Marsh tried to check this fault in her daughter, but her father generally came to the rescue. "Let her take her own pleasure with the money," he would say. "I dislike to see children mean and parsimonious." But Mrs. Marsh took every occasion to direct Jessie, although her advice was not always followed. Jessie was still holding her dollar in her hand as her mother re-entered the room. "See what Uncle Mark gave me to buy sugar plums with," he said, and a radiant smile illumined Jessie's face. "And only yesterday you were wishing for $1, her mother replied. The smile faded a little at that. Jessie had been listening to a poor woman's story the day before. Mrs. Marsh had given her some sewing, as she was very anxious to earn enough money to pay her rent. Counting up what she was likely to get from one and another left her still $1 or $2 short. Ordinarily, Mrs. Marsh would have overpaid her, but now she had a mind to put Jessie's generosity to the test. The little girl had been quite thoughtful for some time after Mrs. Adams' departure, and at last had said, "Oh, Mamma, I wish I had $1. I should give it to Mrs. Adams. How hard it must be to earn money enough to take care of herself and those 3 little children." "Yes," her mother answered gravely, "we ought to be thankful that God has placed us above want." Jessie went to her bank. It never had a very large surplus on hand. 20 cents. That was not near $1. So she gave a little sigh. This was what her mother's words recalled. She looked rather sober over it for several moments. $1 is a good deal for a little girl to give away, she said slowly, as the result of her thoughts. It did not seem so yesterday. It is often easier to be charitable with that which we do not possess. One can't give them when one hasn't anything, Jessie said, and the absurdity made her smile a little. And it is unfortunate not to have the heart and the money at the same time. Jessie did not reply. It was nearly school time, so she hunted up her hood, her squirrel tippet and muff, and her good warm cloak. She had never suffered from any cold or neglect, and there was a sudden rush of gratitude in her heart, for it was a sweet, true, and tender heart. "Good-bye, Mamma," and she came to kiss her. Then she strapped her books together and hung them on her arm and ran down the path. Should she give Mrs. Adams her $1? There were so many things that she wanted. She just halted at Warner's store window. There was a box of paints there that was only $1. She had made 2 or 3 ineffectual attempts to save up her money and get them. And there was a crying baby with the loveliest blue eyes. Her dolly was past the crying stage. She would just go in and price this one. It was such fun to have the squeaky little thing. 75 cents. It was a beauty. And there was a lovely toy in the shape of a pretty carved egg cup with an egg in it. When you touched a spring in the bottom, the upper half of the egg flew off, and the prettiest little fairy made you a bow. That was $1. And a drawing slate with such a charming variety of landscapes, castles, birds, flowers, and nearly everything. Oh, what beautiful things one could buy with $1. "Will you take this baby?" And the shopwoman made it cry like a real live baby, and all the while there was such a roguish look in its blue eyes. "Not just now," Jessie said faintly and turned away. "Oh, you like this cup better?" And then the woman made the fairy spring up so suddenly that Jessie jumped too. How she could startle the boys with it! "I won't take any of them now," Jessie said with sudden determination, and then went out. She had to run to school to be there in time. At recess, Martha Lee displayed a beautiful rubber ring with a pearl in it. It looked so pretty on her white, slender fingers. "It cost just $1, she said, and I saved up all my pennies to buy it." Then she let Jessie try it on. The boys had made Jessie several rings, but they had not the smooth finish of this. And then the pearl! "I mean to have one," exclaimed Belle Anders. "I've about 70 cents saved up." Jessie looked at her finger and decided that she wanted one also. To be sure, there was her pretty birthday ring with rubies, but that wasn't black. The pearl looked so lovely in the jetty setting. Poor Jessie! By the time she had gone home to dinner and come back again, Warner's store seemed as full of treasures as the magic cave, and there were so many things that cost just $1. Her money was fast burning a hole in her pocket. It seems strange that it should have this faculty, but it does appear to produce a curious kind of combustion. Did you ever feel your fingers tingle and burn when you touched 3 or 4 pennies in your pocket? And could you not almost taste the delightful taffy candy that the little old woman 2 doors from the school sold? Mrs. Adams's pale face and troubled eyes interfered with Jessie's peace of mind. She certainly thought yesterday that if she had $1 she would give it to her. Why did she not want to now? Clara Adams hasn't been to school today, Miss Trustell said. Who goes near her house? Jessie swallowed a great lump that seemed to rush up from her heart. I'll call Miss Truesdale. Thank you, Jessie. Clara ought not to miss a day. I'm afraid she is sick. So Jessie went around by another path, almost afraid to pass Warner's again. It was a cold December day, cloudy now, and with the appearance of snow. The wind nipped Jessie's rosy cheeks, but she did not mind. Here was the little cottage, rather cold and forlorn-looking, it must be confessed. Jamie answered her tap at the door. "Oh, come in, Miss Jessie," Mrs. Adams exclaimed, and Jamie shut the door quickly so the biting air would not rush in. "I called to see why Clara wasn't at school today," Jessie said. Clara blushed. Mrs. Adams looked rather troubled. "You're not sick?" "No, Miss Jessie, it wasn't that, but Clara hasn't any shoes. She would freeze her feet in those old ones. Besides, they're out to the ground." Jessie cast a furtive glance at them. Old and shabby indeed. She thought of her own half-worn boots, but although Clara was a smaller girl, her feet were larger than Jessie's. No, that would not do. "I ordered her a pair at Mr. Gregg's, and they're done, only he will not let me have them until I pay down a little, and I've just money enough for my rent, which is due tomorrow. Mr. Dallas is a hard landlord." "Then you have all the money?" Jessie said gladly. "Yes, I am thankful for that, but Clara must wait until next week. I shall have to earn some more." Jessie talked to Jamie and Charlie quite a while and listened to the praises of her own dear mamma, who was always doing a kind turn for everybody, and a plan came into her mind. But then she could not have a crying doll, nor a paint box, nor any of those charming toys that she half coveted. She said good-bye to them presently and went straight to Mr. Gregg's. A woman in a faded shawl was standing by the untidy counter. She had been binding some shoes and brought them home. "I can't give it to you because I haven't a cent in the place," Mr. Gregg was saying. "People won't pay me, and I can't pay others." "But we actually haven't anything in the house, not a mouthful of dinner even," and here the poor woman's tremulous voice broke down. Jessie felt like crying too, but she winked away the tears with great effort. Then she asked Mr. Gregg about Clara's shoes. "There they are," he said rather brusquely, and nodded his head towards a stout pair standing on a little shelf. "Good strong ones, too, and dirt cheap, yet they can't pay for them. I'm done trusting. It's a poor plan and keeps me like a beggar." Then he hammered spitefully upon his lapstone and looked savage. He was a surly old fellow. "Will you let her have them if I give you $1 now, and promise to pay the rest if they can't?" Jessie asked bravely. "Yes, miss." Out came Jessie's $1, spent for a pair of coarse shoes that had not a bit of beauty or grace, like the fairy or the doll or 20 other things. The poor woman approached again. "Oh, Mr. Gregg, well, take it," he said ungraciously. The thin fingers clutched it nervously, and she almost stared at Jessie. "Will you send them down to Mrs. Adams tonight? I'll ask Papa for the rest of the money. How much is it?" "Only $1, cheap enough I must say, but I work for about nothing." When Jessie was in the fresh air, trying to breathe out the smell of wet leather and shoemaker's wax, a hand was laid upon her shoulder. "Heaven bless you, child," a faint voice said. "You've done a kind deed for a friend, and been the means of blessing a stranger. My poor old mother and I were absolutely at starvation point. God must have sent you hither." Jessie's heart swelled too full for utterance. The temptations in Warner's window were nothing to her then. She ran down the street with a light, happy heart. "How late you are," Mrs. Marsh said as Jessie entered. It was dusk in the cozy sitting room. "Mamma," she said presently, "I must tell you I have spent my $1, and I've had such an odd time. I'm satisfied, though." Then Jessie told her mother the whole story. Mrs. Marsh kissed her tenderly. But that was not the end of it. Jessie's $1 was likely to have quite a history of its own. Some time after, on one Saturday, old Matt, who came up to the Marshes to do chores and rough work, made his appearance in a good warm woolen jacket. "How nice and comfortable you are, Matt," Mrs. Marsh said. I was thinking a few days ago how much you needed such a garment. And it came to me most like a present, a queer sort of way that I wasn't counting on. There's a poor woman who does a little sewing and binds shoes for Greg. She came over to our house for loaves of bread, and she'd run up quite a bill when she stopped. For a while I didn't hear anything from her. We'll never ask the poor creature for it, I said to my mother, but last Wednesday she brought $1 to pay up the back, and got some more bread. So says Mother, "Now, Matt, you must have a jacket right away, for I never expected to get this money at all. I have 50 cents that I can put to it, and it'll just do. So now I shan't be so likely to get the rheumats in my shoulders. The Lord sends everything round about right." Jessie glanced up at her mother. Her dollar had benefited even Matt. "Will you tell me where this poor woman lives?" Mrs. Marsh asked. And that afternoon she and Jessie set out to find her, and were in time to rescue 2 human beings from starvation. "What a wonderful dollar," Uncle Mark said as Jessie, sitting on his knee, recounted its adventures. "I think I'll have to put some more out in the same fashion." "It's sweeter than sugar plums," Jessie returned, with a winsome laugh. End of Jessie's Dollar by Amanda Minnie Douglas. Read by Elsie Selwyn. Laura's Lesson by Amanda Minnie Douglas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Elsie Selwyn. Laura's Lesson. "Oh dear," Laura Preston sighed impatiently. "There's the baby awake again. I do wish I could have a little time like the other girls. They're all going to Belle Cunningham's to play crochet, and I meant to ask you if I couldn't go." Laura's voice choked over a sob. It was hard to stay in the house all this beautiful weather, to know what fun the girls were having, and she out of it all, taking care of this tiresome baby. She wished there were no such things as babies in the world. Saturday, she had to give up Annie Graham's little tea party. Monday afternoon, she had a pretty book that had to be returned the next day, and he wouldn't let her read a line. Here it was Wednesday, and it seemed to her that she had done nothing but take care of him for the last month. "If you could take him in the carriage, he'd be so much better for a change in the open air." Mrs. Preston uttered this timidly. She was so ill and worn and looked so tired that at any other time her little daughter's heart would have been moved with pity. "But I couldn't go there, and I shouldn't want to. They'd all call me nursemaid. I don't see why Anne can't find some time to take care of the baby. She used to, I'm sure." "My being sick has made so much more work, you know." At this the baby gave a cry. Laura jerked him up from the cradle, and then he screamed, "You're a little crosspatch." "Bring him to me," said her mother. Laura felt a little ashamed then, and cuddled him up between her face and neck, and began to whisper softly to him. He was very sleepy, and soon shut his eyes. "I guess he will go to sleep again," she said in a gentler tone, and began walking up and down the room. Yet all the time she was thinking of the bright sunshine and the smooth, velvety lawn where the girls were going to play croquet. "Mother," she said presently, "couldn't we have someone come and take care of the baby while you are so poorly? There's Jenny Briggs out of a place." "Mrs. Sayer said that Jenny was very careless, that she wouldn't trust her with the baby. I think I shall be better soon. It is real hard for you. I'm sorry." Something in her mother's voice touched Laura, but she was not in a mood to be very tender. Of course it was hard to have to stay in the house all the time and give up everything. She laid the baby back in his crib and gave another longing glance out of the window. "I think you might go," her mother said presently. "It's only 4 now, and if you could be back by a little after 5. Jamie ought to take a good long nap. He hasn't slept hardly any today." "Oh, I should like to so much." Laura's conscience checked her. She felt that she ought to stay in the house, in case she might be needed. But there was Anne downstairs, and if the baby would sleep— "Yes, you can go." Mrs. Preston felt that Laura had been confined a great deal lately, and the frowning face did not promise very pleasant companionship. However, it cleared up wonderfully now. "Oh, thank you, Mamma. I'll be back real early." Laura ran upstairs and slipped on her white dress. Anne had begged her to save it nice for another Sunday. The ruffles were so botherin' to iron. But it was the very ruffles that she liked. Then she gave her hair a brush, tied on her blue sash, and went down. She ought to go in and kiss poor pale Mamma, but then she might wake the baby. So she stole softly along, lingering a moment on the porch. Was that sound the little rascal Jamie waking up again? No, she guessed not, and down the walk she ran. They had played one game when she reached Belle's handsome house. She was very glad that she had dressed herself so prettily, for here were Belle's cousins, and Mrs. Cummings, and some lady visitors were looking on. "I'm so glad you've come," exclaimed Belle. "We had to take that stupid Sarah Gaines, who hardly knows a mallet from a beanpole. Now we'll have some fun." "It's your day out, I suppose, Laura," drawled Bessie Livingston. "I've heard that you'd turned child's nurse." That vexed Laura, and a heat flashed to her face. "I take care of my little brother sometimes," she said haughtily, yet she wished in her heart that she didn't have it to do. "Come, Blue, run to your place," said Belle. They all went at it in great earnest. Laura was a capital player, generally, but this afternoon her hand didn't seem very steady. She lost her patience easily. She felt flurried and nervous and warm, and found she was on the losing side. And then there was an uncomfortable misgiving tugging at her heart. If the baby should wake, if Anne was busy or out, and poor Mamma did look unusually pale. She might have guessed that Mamma had been worrying with the baby all day, when she said he had not slept any, but just then she did not want to think of anyone besides herself. And now she couldn't help thinking, and the balls became confused in her mind. Until 10 months before, Laura Preston had been an only child, and, of course, indulged a great deal. She seemed so sweet and good-tempered always, but it was because there had been nothing to try her. At first she pronounced the baby splendid, and cared for him nothing else, tended him, caressed him, did yards of tatting, crocheted him a blanket and a cap, and worked him a little skirt. Then her interest began to flag. He took so much time, and was really a great deal of trouble. For the last month Mrs. Preston had been quite poorly, and the baby a greater charge. Laura grew tired of him, she secretly confessed to herself, though it did seem wicked. But it was hard to give up every moment. Mrs. Preston saw with pain that Laura was developing many selfish and unamiable traits. Sometimes she wondered whether it would be best to relieve her of all charge of the baby, or persevere until she had learned one of the hard lessons of life, to think of others for something besides pleasure. Yet, to do Laura justice, she had never been quite so cross as on this day. She didn't enjoy the playing half as much as she expected. Belle thought she wasn't trying at all, and did not care how she played, and presently the game came to an end. Laura said she must go home, but Belle begged her to come in and see her new dresses. "How beautifully yours is made," Mrs. Cummings said. "Belle, Miss Lang must see this waist. I'd like one of yours puffed in that fashion." So Belle took her into the dressmaker, and somehow the time passed rapidly. The clock struck 6. "Oh, I must go!" and Laura made a fresh start. Flying out of the gate, her skirt caught, and in her haste she couldn't stop, so her beautiful dress, that she was so glad of having worn 5 minutes ago, now had a great unsightly rent across one breadth. Laura uttered a passionate cry, more in anger than sorrow. The whole day had gone wrong, for that matter. But first, a little girl had not been quite right in heart. The doctor's carriage was standing before the door. He generally came in the morning, and a sudden fear seized the child. there was one of the neighbors with little Jamie in her arms. "Oh," she said, "Mamma!" "Hush, dear. Mamma is much worse. She has been bleeding at the lungs. This great baby is altogether too much for her. The doctor says she must have a nurse." Poor Laura! She seemed turning to stone. If she had not gone out, and now, if Mamma died, it would be all her fault. Jamie held out his dimpled hands with a smile. It seemed then as if her heart would break. 2 hours ago she had thought him such a trial, and would have felt relieved if there had been no Jamie in the world. He loved her so much, too. She hid her face in his dress and wept bitterly. "Don't cry, dear. She isn't dangerous." "I don't exactly know, but if she keeps quiet and isn't worried, she will get well again." "Poor sister. Tell her not to cry, Jamie." Jamie patted the soft, curly head and said, "Ta-ta," as if he would comfort her. But Laura's heart was so full that she ran off to her room and buried her face in the pillow of her own little bed, wanting to beg God not to punish her as she deserved, but afraid even to pray. Presently someone called her. It was Anne's voice, and changing her dress, she went to the kitchen. "Oh, Miss Laura!" And Anne stopped as she saw the pale, tear-stained face and swollen eyes. "When was Mamma taken so bad?" she asked. "About an hour ago. The baby's been very troublesome all day, and he's a heavy lift for a sick woman. I was going to ask you to do some errands, Miss Laura, but if you'll set the table, I'll go." Laura was glad enough to do anything. Before she was through, the doctor went away, and Mrs. Brown came out with the baby. Then Laura heard a quick, familiar step. She waited with a beating heart, but Anne returned, finished preparing the supper, and yet Papa had not left the room. Baby began to worry, and Laura took him. When the dear little arms tightened round her neck, the quick tears rushed to her eyes again. How could she have thought him a trouble, and been glad to get away? When Mr. Preston came in, he kissed Laura and baby Jamie, asleep on her shoulder. She couldn't eat or hardly speak, but listened to Mrs. Brown and Papa. They didn't seem to think Mrs. Preston so very ill, but Laura really was afraid she would die before morning. And what if she never kissed her again? Then she remembered how she had slipped away in the afternoon, and her heart smote her bitterly enough. A long while after, everything in the house was quiet, baby sleeping soundly in his crib, Mrs. Brown and the nurse in Mrs. Preston's room, and Anne gone to bed. Only poor Laura sitting in the kitchen alone. "My dear child," her father said, entering the room. "Oh, Papa!" She sprang up and was clasped to his breast. "Hush, my darling. Mamma is very comfortable and not in any danger. All she needs is good care. She is worried too much for the baby, but we will have a nurse for him." "Oh, Papa, that is what I want to talk about. I've been so wicked. I don't know as anyone can ever forgive me, and if Mamma had died, I should always have felt as if I had killed her." "Why, my child," Mr. Preston began in astonishment. "Yes, I ought to have stayed and taken care of the baby. I knew Mamma was weak and sick, though she didn't say that she had worried with him all day. But it seemed to me that I hadn't been anywhere for ever and ever so long, and I did want to play croquet with the girls. I didn't enjoy hardly a moment of it, though, and now I am so sorry that I went." Laura's voice broke down entirely then, and she was sobbing in her father's arms. "My little girl," he said gravely, "this is a hard lesson indeed. It is doubtful if Mamma would have been quite so bad if she had not overtasked herself. But the doctor said the bleeding was not from her lungs, and that it is really better she should give up, and have good care taken of her. We shall have a nurse for Master Jamie. I proposed this some time ago, but Mamma thought it was best for you to have some little charge of him, seeing that he was your only brother. But it does confine you very much, so long as she is not well. Only my little daughter ought to learn to think for others, or she will be in danger of growing up a selfish, unamiable woman." "Oh, Papa, I don't believe I ever shall forget again," sobbed Laura. "And if Mamma gets well—" "I think she will. Let us both pray earnestly." Laura did not ask to see Mamma that night. She determined to bear bravely the punishment she had brought upon herself, and she prayed a long while that she might be kept purer in heart and learn to be unselfish. She did not forget the next morning. Laura was a neat, handy little girl and could do a great deal when she chose. She helped Anne now and took care of her brother in such a pretty, winsome manner that Anne quite forgot the scolding she meant to give her, for the maid felt herself one of the family she had been with them so long. Laura was glad at last to be able to go in and see her mamma. They had a tender talk about the incidents of the day before, and Mrs. Preston felt satisfied that they would make a lasting impression upon her. I do not mean that Laura was altogether perfect after that, for everyone has to try daily and hourly as long as he or she lives. But she tried to think of others and to make them happy, and she found, as people always do, that she was the happier for it herself. Mrs. Preston recovered to Laura's unbounded delight. They had a nurse for Jamie, but the little rogue thought his sister much to be preferred, and Mrs. Preston was thankful to see so cheerful a spirit growing up within her. If ever she felt tempted to fret, or felt a frown rising to her sunny brow, she tried to check it immediately by remembering the sad night she had passed when Mamma was so ill. Anne could not help scolding about the torn dress, and Laura took it very meekly. It was part of her lesson, she admitted, the one all children have to learn, that their own way may not be the best, even if they can be indulged in it. End of Laura's Lesson by Amanda Minnie Douglas. Read by Elsie Selwyn.
Perez the Mouse, adapted from the Spanish of Padre Luis Coloma by Lady Morton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Once upon a time, there lived a king called Bubby the First, who was very kind to poor children and mice. For the children he built a factory for making dolls and cardboard horses. For the benefit of the mice, he made wise laws to stop cats catching them, and absolutely forbade the use of mouse traps. Bubby began to reign when he was only 6 years old, under the care of his mother, who was very good and clever, and who watched over him and guided his steps, as good children are guided by their guardian angel. Bubby was a darling little boy, and when on great days they put on his gold crown and his embroidered robes, the gold of his crown was not brighter than his hair, nor the ermine of his robes softer than his cheeks and hands. He was just like a little Dresden china figure, which had been put to sit on a throne instead of standing on the chimney-piece. One day, while the king was eating his bread and milk, one of his teeth began to wobble. There was a great fuss, and the court doctors arrived in a hurry. They were all agreed that His Majesty had begun to change his teeth, and at length they settled to pull out the loose one. They wanted the king to have laughing gas, as he did when his hair was cut, as he always fidgeted so, but Bubby was a brave little boy, and made up his mind to have it out with nothing. The oldest of the court doctors tied a bit of red silk round the tooth, and then gave a tweak, and he pulled so cleverly that, while the king was making a face, out came the tooth, as round and white as a little pearl. Then there was another fuss as to what was to be done with it, but Bubby's mother, who, as we have said, was a very wise queen, and very loyal to old customs, settled that the king should write a very polite letter and put it with the tooth in an envelope under his pillow that night, which has always been the proper thing to do ever since the world began. And no one has ever known Perez the Mouse forget to come and fetch the tooth and leave a lovely present in its place. King Bubby found writing that letter a dreadful task, but he managed really quite well in the end, and only inked all his fingers, the tip of his nose, his left ear, his right shoe, and his bib. He went to bed very early that evening, and ordered that all the lights should be left in his room. He put the envelope under his pillow, and sat up in bed determined to keep awake to see Perez the Mouse, even if he had to wait all night. Perez the Mouse was a long time coming, so the little king began to make up a little speech to say to him when he did arrive. After a bit, Bubby began to open his eyes very wide, fighting against the miller who was trying to make him shut them. But they did shut at last, and the little boy slipped down into the warm bedclothes, his head on the pillow, with one arm over it, as a little bird tucks its head under its wing when it goes to sleep. Suddenly, he felt something very soft just tickling his forehead, and sitting up quickly, he saw in front of him, standing on the pillow, a tiny little mouse in a straw hat and slippers and big gold spectacles. A red satchel was slung across his back. King Bubby stared at him in astonishment, and Perez the Mouse, seeing that his Majesty was awake, took off his hat and made a very low bow, waiting to be spoken to. But the king said nothing, because he had quite forgotten all he had made up to say. And after thinking and thinking, he faltered out at last, Good night." Perez answered with a low bow, "God give your Majesty a very good one." These civil speeches quite broke the ice, and the king and the mouse became the greatest friends. It was easy to see that Perez was a mouse who was accustomed to polite society, and to run about on soft carpets, as he had such very good manners. It was wonderful what a lot of things he could talk about, which made him a very pleasant companion. He had traveled through all the pipes and drains of the capital, and in the royal library alone he had eaten up 3 books in less than a week. He talked, too, about his family. He had 2 quite grown-up daughters, Adelaide and Elvira, and a son, nearly grown up, called Adolphus, who was studying for diplomacy in the drawer where the Minister of State kept his most secret notes. He did not say much about Mrs. Mouse, and the little king somehow fancied that she was rather vulgar. His Majesty listened to all this with his mouth open. From time to time he put out his hand to try and catch Perez by the tail, but each time the mouse gave a sort of whisk and placed his tail out of reach, without being in the least rude. It was getting late, and the king forgot to dismiss him, so Mr. Mouse cleverly hinted that he had to go that same night to a street not far off to fetch the tooth of a very poor little boy called Giles. It was rather a difficult, dangerous journey, because near there lived a very wicked cat called Don Pedro. The king at once wanted to go too, and begged Perez to take him. The mouse stood thinking it over and twisting his whiskers. The responsibility was very great, and moreover he was obliged to go back to his own house to fetch the present for little Giles. The king said he would like to go and see the mouse's home, which so much flattered Perez that he at once offered him a cup of tea and agreed to take him to see little Giles. Perez the Mouse lived underneath a grocer's shop, near a big pile of Gruyere cheeses, which supplied the whole family with breakfast, dinner, and tea. Overjoyed, King Bubby jumped out of bed and began to dress himself, when all at once Perez the Mouse sprang on his shoulder and put the tip of his tail into His Majesty's nose. Then a wonderful thing happened. The king sneezed very hard and turned into the most darling little mouse you ever saw. He was all soft and shiny, and had wee green eyes like emeralds. Perez the Mouse took him by the paw and disappeared with him down a tiny hole under the bed, which had been hidden by the carpet. The way was dark and sticky, but they scampered along. Sometimes Perez the Mouse stopped at some crossway and looked about before going on, which rather frightened the king, and made him feel little shivers right down to the tip of his tail. And he knew that he was afraid, but he remembered that fear is natural to the prudent. To conquer it is to be courageous. So he would not let himself be frightened, which is being really brave. Once when he heard a tremendous noise, like dozens of motor omnibuses passing over his head, he whispered to ask Perez if that was where Don Pedro lived. But Mr. Mouse said no with his tail, and on they went. After going down a gentle slope, they came to a big cellar, which felt nice and warm and smelt very much of cheese. Behind a pile of Gruyere cheese, they found themselves face to face with the Huntley and Palmer biscuit tin, which was the home of the Perez family. Here they lived as happily as the rat of fable did in the Dutch cheese. Perez the Mouse introduced the king as a foreign tourist who was on a visit to the capital, and the family welcomed him very cordially. The two Miss Mouses were at work with their governess, Miss Stilton, who was a very learned English mouse, and Mrs. Mouse was embroidering a beautiful smoking cap for her husband, sitting by a bright fire made of raisin stalks. This happy family party delighted King Bubby. Adelaide and Elvira made tea and poured out some into lovely wee cups made out of the skins of white beans. Then they had a little music. Adelaide sang Desdemona's song, "O Willow, Willow," in a way which much pleased the king, and Elvira recited about a little mouse who was ill of fever, and a naughty kitten who wanted to pounce on it. After this, Adolphus came in from the jockey club, where, to the sorrow of his father and mother, he wasted all his time playing cards with the mice from the foreign embassies. King Bubby would willingly have stayed longer, but Perez, who had slipped away, came back with his satchel on his back and said it was time to start. So the king said goodbye very politely, and Mrs. Mouse gave him a kiss on each cheek in her homely way. Adelaide put out a paw in a lackadaisical fashion, and Elvira shook hands like a pump handle, while Miss Stilton made him a beautiful cheese of a curtsy, and then stared at him through her eyeglasses until he was out of sight. Adolphus, too, was very gushing and conducted him as far as the lid of the tin, and offered to introduce him at the polo club, for which the king thanked him very much, thinking all the time that though he might be a very smart young mouse, he was rather a bore. Then Bubby and Perez, the mouse, again began their scamper with such a quantity of precautions that the king was astonished. In front of them went a regiment of ferocious mice, soldiers whose bayonets, made of fine needles, gleamed in the darkness. Behind them came a second regiment, also armed to the teeth. Perez the Mouse then confessed that he would not have undertaken this expedition without these soldiers to protect the person of the young monarch. All of a sudden, King Bubby saw the guard in front had disappeared down a little hole, through which came a faint light. This was the moment of danger. Perez the Mouse, slowly waggling his tail from side to side, put his head very cautiously through the hole and looked around. He then went back 2 steps and finally, suddenly seizing the king's paw, dashed through the hole like an arrow, crossed a big kitchen, and disappeared through another hole on the opposite side near the range. As one sees telegraph posts out of the train, so Bubby saw that kitchen. By the hearth, in the glow of the fire, lay an enormous cat, the dreadful Don Pedro, its great whiskers heaving up and down as it breathed. The guards silently formed up from hole to hole, ready to fire to protect the king's root from the sleeping cat. It was all very grand and imposing. An ugly old woman sat in a chair, also asleep, with her knitting on her knee. Once through the hole, the danger was over, and they had only to get upstairs, as this was where little Giles lived. Everything was open in his poor room, which was all cracks and draughts. King Bubby scrambled on to the arm of a seatless chair, the only one in the room, and from there could see a picture of poverty such as he had never dreamt of. The sloping roof joined the floor, so that on one side a man could not have stood upright, and through the holes the cold air of dawn was coming, while icicles hung from the roof. The only furniture besides the chair was an empty bread-basket hanging up, and in a corner a bed of straw and rags, on which little Giles and his mother were lying fast asleep. Perez the Mouse drew nearer, taking the king by the paw, and they could see how little Giles was huddled up in the rags, and how he was cuddled up against his mother for warmth. And it made the king so unhappy that he began to cry. Why had he never known that people were so poor? How was it that he had never been told that children were hungry and had to sleep on horrid beds? He did not want any blankets on his cot till every child in his kingdom had plenty of bedclothes to keep them warm. Perez the Mouse brushed away a tear with his paw, and then tried to comfort the king by showing him the bright gold coin he was going to put under little Giles's pillow in exchange for his first tooth. Just then Giles's mother woke and sat up in bed and looked at her little boy, who was still asleep. It was becoming light, and she had to earn some money by washing clothes in the river. She caught the sleeping Giles in her arms and made him kneel down under a picture of the infant Christ, which was pinned to the wall near the bed. The king and Perez, the mouse, knelt down too, and so did the soldier mice who were waiting in the empty bread-basket. The child began to pray, "Our Father, which art in heaven." Bubby started and looked at Perez the Mouse, who understood his astonishment and fixed his piercing eyes on him, but never said a single word. On the return journey, they were silent and preoccupied, and half an hour later the king was home in his nursery with Perez the Mouse, who again put the tip of his tail into Bubby's nose and made him sneeze. All at once he found himself safely back again in his own warm little cot, with the queen's arms round him, who woke him, as she always did, with a kiss. At first he thought it had all been a dream, but when he looked for the letter he had put under his pillow, he found it was gone, and in its place was a case with the Order of the Golden Fleece in diamonds, a magnificent present from the generous Perez the Mouse in exchange for his first tooth. Perhaps I had better explain to English children that in King Bubby's country the Order of the Golden Fleece is like our Order of the Garter, the greatest honor the king can give. The little king, however, paid no attention to his beautiful present, and let it lie unnoticed on the bed, while, leaning on his elbow, he lay very busy thinking. Then, suddenly, he asked the queen in a very solemn voice, "Mamma, why do poor children say the same prayer as I do?" "Our Father, which art in heaven," the queen answered, "because he is as much their father as he is yours." Then said the king thoughtfully, "We must be brothers." "Yes, my darling, they are your brothers," answered the queen. Bubby's eyes were filled with astonishment, and in a choky voice he asked, "Then why am I a king and have everything I want, while they are poor and have nothing?" The queen gave him a squeeze, and kissing him again on his forehead, said, "Because you are the eldest brother, which is what being king really means. You understand, darling, God has given you everything in order that your younger brothers should want for nothing." "I never knew this before," said Bubby, shaking his head, and without thinking any more about his present, he began to say his prayers, as he did every morning, and as he prayed, it seemed to him that all the poor little boys in the kingdom came round him with their hands clasped, and that he, the eldest brother, spoke for them all when he prayed, "Our Father which art in heaven." King Bubby grew up to be a great ruler. He always asked God's help in all he did, and returned thanks for his happiness, ever saying, speaking for all his subjects, poor and rich, good and bad, "Our Father which art in heaven." And when he died, a very old man, and his good soul arrived at the gates of heaven, he knelt down and prayed as usual, "Our Father." And as he prayed, the gates were opened wide by thousands of poor little children to whom he had been king, that is to say, eldest brother here on earth. P.S. The Spanish story, which was written once upon a time to amuse a real little boy king, ends here. But I cannot help adding that it does seem a pity not to try and get Perez the Mouse to come to England. The only way to manage this will be to take great pains over your copies and spelling, so that when your first tooth comes out, you will be able to write a nice, tidy, polite letter to him. If you put it under your pillow at night, I am nearly sure you will find it gone, and a present in its place in the morning. Perhaps you may even feel the same little soft tickle on your forehead that King Bubby did. But I do not promise for certain that you will see kind Mr. Mouse, because he is rather shy. End of Perez the Mouse by Padre Luis Coloma and Lady Morton. Read by C.J.
The Tale of Samuel Whiskers, or the Roly-Poly Pudding, by Beatrix Potter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Once upon a time, there was an old cat called Mrs. Tabitha Twitchit, who was an anxious parent. She used to lose her kittens continually, and whenever they were lost, they were always in mischief. On baking day, she determined to shut them up in a cupboard. She caught Moppet and Mittens, but she could not find Tom. Mrs. Tabitha went up and down all over the house, mewing for Tom Kitten. She looked in the pantry, under the staircase, and she searched the best spare bedroom that was all covered up with dust sheets. She went right upstairs and looked into the attics, but she could not find him anywhere. It was an old, old house, full of cupboards and passages. Some of the walls were 4 feet thick, and there used to be queer noises inside them, as if there might be a little secret staircase. Certainly, there were odd little jagged doorways in the wainscot, and things disappeared at night, especially cheese and bacon. Mrs. Tabitha became more and more distracted, and mewed dreadfully. While their mother was searching the house, Moppet and Mittens had got into mischief. The cupboard door was not locked, so they pushed it open and came out. They went straight to the dough, which was set to rise in a pan before the fire. They patted it with their little soft paws. "Shall we make dear little muffins?" said Mittens to Moppet. But just at that moment, somebody knocked at the front door, and Moppet jumped into the flour barrel in a fright. Mittens ran away to the dairy and hid in an empty jar on the stone shelf where the milk pans stand. The visitor was a neighbor, Mrs. Ribby. She had called to borrow some yeast. Mrs. Tabitha came downstairs mewing dreadfully. "Come in, Cousin Ribby, come in, and sit ye down. I'm in sad trouble, Cousin Ribby," said Tabitha, shedding tears. "I've lost my dear son Thomas. I'm afraid the rats have got him." She wiped her eyes with her apron. "He's a bad kitten, Cousin Tabitha. He made a cat's cradle of my best bonnet last time I came to tea. Where have you looked for him?" "All over the house. The rats are too many for me. What a thing it is to have an unruly family," said Mrs. Tabitha Twitchit. "I am not afraid of rats. I will help you to find him, and whip him too. What is all that soot in the fender?" "The chimney wants sweeping. Oh, dear me, Cousin Ribby, now Moppet and Mittens are gone. They have both got out of the cupboard." Ribby and Tabitha set to work to search the house thoroughly again. They poked under the beds with Ribby's umbrella, and they rummaged in cupboards. They even fetched a candle and looked inside a clothes chest in one of the attics. They could not find anything, but once they heard a door bang, and somebody scuttered downstairs. "Yes, it is infested with rats," said Tabitha tearfully. "I caught 7 young ones out of one hole in the back kitchen, and we had them for dinner last Saturday. And once I saw the old father rat, an enormous old rat, Cousin Ribby. I was just going to jump upon him when he showed his yellow teeth at me and whisked down the hole." "The rats get upon my nerves, Cousin Ribby," said Tabitha. Ribby and Tabitha searched and searched. They both heard a curious roly-poly noise under the attic floor, but there was nothing to be seen. They returned to the kitchen. "Here's one of your kittens at least," said Ribby, dragging Moppet out of the flour barrel. They shook the flour off her and set her down on the kitchen floor. She seemed to be in a terrible fright. "Oh, Mother, Mother," said Moppet, "there's been an old woman rat in the kitchen, and she's stolen some of the dough." The 2 cats ran to look at the dough pan. Sure enough, There were marks of little scratching fingers, and a lump of dough was gone. "Which way did she go, Moppet?" But Moppet had been too much frightened to peep out of the barrel again. Ribby and Tabitha took her with them to keep her safely in sight while they went on with their search. They went into the dairy. The first thing they found was Mittens, hiding in an empty jar. They tipped up the jar, and she scrambled out. "Oh, Mother, Mother," said Mittens. "Oh, Mother, Mother, there has been an old man rat in the dairy. A dreadful, enormous big rat, Mother, and he's stolen a pat of butter and the rolling pin." Ribby and Tabitha looked at one another. "A rolling pin and butter! Oh, my poor son Thomas!" exclaimed Tabitha, wringing her paws. "A rolling pin?" said Ribby. "Did we not hear a roly-poly noise in the attic when we were looking into that chest?" Ribby and Tabitha rushed upstairs again. Sure enough, the roly-poly noise was still going on quite distinctly under the attic floor. "This is serious, Cousin Tabitha," said Ribby. "We must send for John Joyner at once, with a saw." Now this is what had been happening to Tom Kitten, and it shows how very unwise it is to go up a chimney in a very old house where a person does not know his way and where there are enormous rats. Tom Kitten did not want to be shut up in a cupboard. When he saw that his mother was going to bake, he determined to hide. He looked about for a nice convenient place, and he fixed upon the chimney. The fire had only just been lighted, and it was not hot, but there was a white, choky smoke from the green sticks. Tom Kitten got upon the fender and looked up. It was a big, old-fashioned fireplace. The chimney itself was wide enough inside for a man to stand up and walk about, so there was plenty of room for a little tomcat. He jumped right up into the fireplace, balancing himself upon the iron bar where the kettle hangs. Tom Kitten took another big jump off the bar and landed on a ledge high up inside the chimney, knocking down some soot into the fender. Tom Kitten coughed and choked with the smoke, and he could hear the sticks beginning to crackle and burn in the fireplace down below. He made up his mind to climb right to the top and get out on the slates and try to catch sparrows. "I cannot go back. If I slipped, I might fall in the fire and singe my beautiful tail and my little blue jacket." The chimney was a very big, old-fashioned one. It was built in the days when people burnt logs of wood upon the hearth. The chimney stack stood up above the roof like a little stone tower, and the daylight shone down from the top, under the slanting slates that kept out the rain. Tom Kitten was getting very frightened. He climbed up, and up, and up. Then he waded sideways through inches of soot. He was like a little sweep himself. It was most confusing in the dark. One flue seemed to lead into another. There was less smoke, but Tom Kitten felt quite lost. He scrambled up and up, but before he reached the chimney top, he came to a place where somebody had loosened a stone in the wall. There were some mutton bones lying about. "This seems funny," said Tom Kitten. "Who has been gnawing bones up here in the chimney? I wish I had never come. And what a funny smell! It is something like mouse, only dreadfully strong. It makes me sneeze," said Tom Kitten. He squeezed through the hole in the wall and dragged himself along a most uncomfortably tight passage where there was scarcely any light. He groped his way carefully for several yards. He was at the back of the skirting board in the attic, where there is a little mark in the picture. All at once he fell head over heels in the dark, down a hole, and landed on a heap of very dirty rags. When Tom Kitten picked himself up and looked about him, he found himself in a place that he had never seen before, although he had lived all his life in the house. It was a very small, stuffy, fusty room, with boards and rafters and cobwebs and lath and plaster. Opposite to him, as far away as he could sit, was an enormous rat. "What do you mean by tumbling into my bed all covered with smuts?" said the rat, chattering his teeth. "Please, sir, the chimney wants sweeping," said poor Tom Kitten. Anna Maria, squeaked the rat. There was a pattering noise, and an old woman rat poked her head round a rafter. All in a minute she rushed upon Tom Kitten, and before he knew what was happening, his coat was pulled off, and he was rolled up in a bundle and tied with string in very hard knots. Anna Maria did the tying. The old rat watched her and took snuff. When she had finished, they both sat staring at him with their mouths open. "Anna Maria," said the old man rat, whose name was Samuel Whiskers. "Anna Maria, make me a kitten dumpling roly-poly pudding for my dinner." "It requires dough and a pat of butter and a rolling pin," said Anna Maria, considering Tom Kitten with her head on one side. "No," said Samuel Whiskers. "Make it properly, Anna Maria, with breadcrumbs." "Nonsense! Butter and dough," replied Anna Maria. The two rats consulted together for a few minutes and then went away. Samuel Whiskers got through a hole in the wainscot and went boldly down the front staircase to the dairy to get the butter. He did not meet anybody. He made a second journey for the rolling pin. He pushed it in front of him with his paws like a brewer's man trundling a barrel. He could hear Ribby and Tabitha talking, but they were busy lighting the candle to look into the chest. They did not see him. Anna Maria went down by way of the skirting board and a window shutter to the kitchen to steal the dough. She borrowed a small saucer and scooped up the dough with her paws. She did not observe Moppet. While Tom Kitten was left alone under the floor of the attic, he wriggled about and tried to mew for help. But his mouth was full of soot and cobwebs, and he was tied up in such very tight knots he could not make anybody hear him, except a spider, which came out of a crack in the ceiling and examined the knots critically from a safe distance. It was a judge of knots, because it had a habit of tying up unfortunate bluebottles. It did not offer to assist him. Tom Kitten wriggled and squirmed until he was quite exhausted. Presently the rats came back and set to work to make him into a dumpling. First they smeared him with butter, and then they rolled him in the dough. "Will not the string be very indigestible, Anna Maria?" inquired Samuel Whiskers. Anna Maria said she thought that it was of no consequence, but she wished that Tom Kitten would hold his head still, as it disarranged the pastry. She laid hold of his ears. Tom Kitten bit and spat and mewed and wriggled, and the rolling pin went roly-poly, roly, roly-poly, roly. The rats each held an end. "His tail is sticking out. You did not fetch enough dough, Anna Maria." "I fetched as much as I could carry," replied Anna Maria. "I do not think," said Samuel Whiskers, pausing to take a look at Tom Kitten, "I do not think it will be a good pudding. It smells sooty." Anna Maria was about to argue the point, when all at once there began to be other sounds up above, the rasping noise of a saw and the noise of a little dog scratching and yelping. The rats dropped the rolling pin and listened attentively. "We are discovered and interrupted, Anna Maria. Let us collect our property and other people's and depart at once. I fear that we shall be obliged to leave this pudding. But I am persuaded that the knots would have proved indigestible, whatever you may urge to the contrary. Come away at once and help me to tie up some mutton bones in a counterpane," said Anna Maria. "I have got half a smoked ham hidden in the chimney." So it happened that by the time John Joiner had got the plank up, there was nobody under the floor except the rolling pin and Tom Kitten in a very dirty dumpling. But there was a strong smell of rats, and John Joiner spent the rest of the morning sniffing and whining and wagging his tail and going round and round with his head in the hole like a gimlet. Then he nailed the plank down again and put his tools in his bag and came downstairs. The cat family had quite recovered. They invited him to stay to dinner. The dumpling had been peeled off Tom Kitten and made separately into a bag pudding with currants in it to hide the smuts. They had been obliged to put Tom Kitten into a hot bath to get the butter off. John Joiner smelt the pudding, but he regretted that he had not time to stay to dinner, because he had just finished making a wheelbarrow for Miss Potter, and she had ordered 2 hen coops. And when I was going to the post late in the afternoon, I looked up the lane from the corner, and I saw Mr. Samuel Whiskers and his wife on the run, with big bundles on a little wheelbarrow, which looked very like mine. They were just turning in at the gate to the barn of Farmer Potatoes. Samuel Whiskers was puffing and out of breath. Anna Maria was still arguing in shrill tones. She seemed to know her way, and she seemed to have a quantity of luggage. I am sure I never gave her leave to borrow my wheelbarrow. They went into the barn and hauled their parcels with a bit of string to the top of the haymow. After that, there were no more rats for a long time at Tabitha Twitchit's. As for Farmer Potatoes, he has been driven nearly distracted. There are rats and rats and rats in his barn. They eat up the chicken food and steal the oats and bran and make holes in the meal bags. And they are all descended from Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Whiskers, children and grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren. There is no end to them. Moppet and Mittens have grown up into very good rat-catchers. They go out rat-catching in the village, and they find plenty of employment. They charge so much a dozen, and earn their living very comfortably. They hang up the rats' tails in a row on the barn door to show how many they have caught. Dozens and dozens of them. But Tom Kitten has always been afraid of a rat. He never durst face anything that is bigger than a mouse. End of the Tale of Samuel Whiskers, or the Roly-Poly Pudding, by Beatrix Potter.
The Snowman, by Hans Christian Andersen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Snowman. How white he looked as he stood there in the garden all alone. He had 2 3-cornered bits of tile in his head instead of eyes. His mouth was made of an old broken rake, and as you may suppose, he had quite a fair supply of teeth. He had grown up that day amid the joyous shouts of boys and girls, the whir of skates on the ice, the jingling of bells, and the crack of whips on the sledges. When he was finished, the boys and girls danced round him and gave 3 hearty cheers. Then they left him and went indoors. "What splendid weather it is," said he to himself. "This wind goes fairly through and through me, and makes me feel so strong that I quite crackle all over. What, I wonder, is that fiery red thing hanging in the sky? It needn't stare at me. It won't make me blink. I'll stare it out of countenance." And he watched the sun as it slowly sank down in the west. Then the full moon rose, large, round, bright, and beautiful in the blue air. "There it comes again from another part," said the Snowman, for he mistook the moon for the sun. "I have cured him of his staring, though, and now he may hang there and shine so that I can see myself. How I wish I could move! I would so like to bestir myself and skim across the ice like the children, but I'm no good at it. I don't know how to run." "Oof, oof!" barked the old watchdog. He was so hoarse he could not say "bow wow" like other dogs. "When the sun comes out he'll teach you to run. That's what he did last winter with one of your sort, and I remember it was the same the winter before. Oof, oof! I'll have to go." "I do not understand you, friend," answered the Snowman. "Is the pale thing up there to teach me to run? To be sure, it ran off a little while ago when I looked steadily at it, and now it slinks back from the other side." "What you know doesn't come to much," said the dog. "But then, poor thing, what can one expect? After all, you were only rolled together today. The pale thing you see up there is the moon. It was the sun that went away a little while ago. It'll come back tomorrow, and will teach you to run down into the ditch. You may take my word for that. Oof, oof! We are to have a change of weather. I feel it in my left hind leg, it aches so. Yes, I'm sure we are to have a change. Oof, oof!" he barked. Then he turned around 3 times and crept into his kennel to sleep. The weather did change. When morning came, a thick fog lay over the country. Later there came an ice-cold wind, which with the keen front made the folks shiver. By and by the sun rose, scattering the fog and making the hoarfrost glitter and sparkle as if everything were covered with diamond dust, and large diamonds were glittering over earth's snow carpet, or as if countless little lights, whiter than itself, were shining amid the snow. "What a lovely scene!" exclaimed a bright-eyed girl who had just come into the garden. She and her companion, a tall, slim boy, stood beside the Snowman, gazing with wonder and delight at the glittering scene. "Summer could offer us no finer sight than this," she said, almost in a whisper. "Summer could not give us such a fine fellow as this," said her companion, pointing to the Snowman. "He is splendid." The girl laughed and nodded to the Snowman, and then danced away with her companion over the snow, which creaked and crunched under their feet. "Who are those 2?" said the Snowman to the watchdog. "Do you know them? You've been longer in the yard than I." "Do I know them?" answered the dog. "To be sure I do. They've been very good to me. She always pats me and he throws me bones. I don't bite those 2, I can tell you. I pity you, of course. It's not your fault that you know so little. How could it be otherwise with one who came into the world only yesterday? As for me, I know everyone belonging to this house. I was not always a mere watchdog. There was a time when I had not to lie as I do now, chained here in the cold." "Oof, oof!" he barked. "It breaks my heart to think of those times." "The cold is splendid," said the Snowman. "Do tell me your story, please. But for goodness' sake, don't make that noise with your chain. It makes me shiver." "Oof, oof!" barked the dog. "Once I was a little fellow, small and pretty, at least they said I was. I lay on a velvet couch in those days and moved in the very highest society. Nothing was too good for me then. The ladies used to kiss me and to wipe my paws with their lace handkerchiefs. But later I grew too big for them, and they gave me to the housekeeper. From where you are standing you can see into the room where I was master, for the housekeeper let me do as I liked. Dear, dear, how pleasant it all was! In the housekeeper's room there was the most beautiful stove in the world. How I did love to lie in front of that stove, and sometimes at night I crept under it, and it was so cozy. Ah, me! You'd hardly believe it, but often I yet dream of that stove. Woof, woof. A stove, said the Snowman. Is a stove then so pretty? Does it look like me? Like you, said the dog with a growl. Not in the least. It is glossy and black, and has a long neck with a brass body. It lives on wood, which the fire sputters out of its mouth. When one keeps close to it, it is very comfortable. If you look through the window, you can see it from where you stand. The Snowman looked in and saw a brightly polished thing with a brass body in which the fire glowed. At the sight, a queer feeling crept over him. He did not know what it was. He could not explain it, for you see, after all, he was only a snowman. How could you give up such a place? And how could you leave such beauty? He asked the dog. Had to, the latter replied. I had no wish to do so. I can tell you, I was driven out of doors and chained up here before I knew where I was. But what was wrong? Why did they treat you so cruelly? Asked the other. Oh, that was all right, said the dog. Their notions of fair play and mine did not agree, that was all. Bone for bone is my notion of what's fair. So one day I bit the leg of the smallest youngster because he kicked away my bone. That was a fine to-do, I need hardly say. They never thought of me, never thought how they would like to have one of their own bones kicked away. They dragged me from the room, thrashed me till I could hardly stand, and chained me up here where I've been ever since. Oh, oh! I can't forget how unfairly I was treated and how much I lost. Why, I lost even my voice. Don't you hear how I am? Oof, oof! I can't even speak like other dogs. The Snowman was no longer listening to him. He was gazing into the housekeeper's room. He could not take his eyes from the stove, which he now saw was of about the same size as himself. How queer I feel, said he. Shall I never go in there? I'm sure there's no harm in wishing to do so. Oh dear, I feel as if I must get in and lean against it, even if I have to break a window. In there you'll never get, said the dog. Besides, if you did, the stove would soon make an end of you. Oof, oof! I fear that I'm already as good as off, said the Snowman. I feel that I'm breaking up. The whole day long the Snowman kept peeping through the window into the room. Night came, and the room and stove looked prettier even than during the day. From the stove there came a soft light, but when the door was opened, a clear ruddy flame shot up, which lit up the white face of the Snowman and made his whole bosom glow. The night was long, but it did not seem long to the Snowman, and he stood there, completely taken up with his own beautiful thoughts. He was perfectly happy. Moreover, it froze keenly, and he felt strong and well. In the morning, the window of the room was covered with ice. The panes bore ice flowers, more lovely even than a snowman's dream. But alas, he could no longer see through them. The stove was hidden. The frost was so keen a one that the heart of a snowman should have been glad, but the ice flowers on the panes did not thaw, and our snowman was anything but thankful for that. He was greatly disappointed, and wished at last there was no such thing as frost. All too soon for him, his wish was granted. Hardly had he uttered it, when the watchdog came out of his kennel. Hoof, hoof, he barked. We are going to have a change of weather. And the weather did change. It began to thaw. As the weather grew warmer, the Snowman grew thinner and thinner. He did not cry out, made in fact no complaint, which was a sure sign that his illness was serious. At last he grew so weak that one morning he broke down altogether and fell in a heap. And lo, where he had stood, something like a broomstick was left sticking up from the ground. It was the pole round which the children had built their snowman. Ah, now I see why you were so fond of the stove, said the yard dog. Why, there's the stove shovel hanging to the pole. He was right. The Snowman had a stove scraper in his body. That was why he was so fond of the stove. "It's all over now," said the yard dog, and soon the winter passed and the dog barked, "Oof, oof, I'm glad the winter's gone." But the boys and girls from the house sang, "Hie forth, green foresters, to the gay woods, where the willows have donned their soft yellow hoods. There loudly the lark and the mistle thrush sing their songs of glad welcome and greeting to spring. Now, with these songsters, come, let us awake the quick, gladsome echoes in dell and in brake. Welcome, 1,000 times welcome, dear son. Winter's cold glooms and black frosts now are done, and no one thought any more of the Snowman." And The Snowman, read by Sandra.
The Tale of Peter Rabbit by Beatrix Potter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Once upon a time, there were 4 little rabbits, and their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank underneath the root of a very big fir tree. "Now, my dears," said old Miss Rabbit one morning, "you may go into the field or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father had an accident there. He was put in a pie by Miss McGregor. Now, run along and don't get into mischief. I'm going out." Then old Miss Rabbit took a basket and her umbrella and went through the wood to the baker's. She bought a loaf of brown bread and 5 currant buns. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were good little bunnies, went down the lane to gather blackberries. But Peter, who was very naughty, ran straight away to Mr. McGregor's garden and squeezed under the gate. First he ate some lettuces and some French beans, and then he ate some radishes. And then, feeling rather sick, he went to look for some parsley. But round the end of a cucumber frame, whom should he meet but Mr. McGregor? Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees planting out young cabbages, but he jumped up and ran after Peter, waving a rake and calling, "Stop, thief!" Peter was most dreadfully frightened. He rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten the way back to the gate. He lost one of his shoes among the cabbages and the other shoe amongst the potatoes. After losing them, he ran on 4 legs and went faster, so that I think he may have gotten away altogether if he had not unfortunately ran into a gooseberry net and got caught by the large buttons on his jacket. It was a blue jacket with brass buttons, quite new. Peter gave himself up for lost and shed big tears. But his sobs were overheard by some friendly sparrows, who flew to him in great excitement and implored him to exert himself. Mr. McGregor came up with a sieve, which he intended to pop upon the top of Peter. But Peter wriggled out just in time, leaving his jacket behind him, and rushed into the tool shed and jumped into a can. It would have been a beautiful thing to hide in, if it had not had so much water in it. Mr. McGregor was quite sure that Peter was somewhere in the tool shed, perhaps hidden underneath a flower pot. He began to turn them over carefully, looking under each. Presently, Peter sneezed. "K-k-k-chew!" Mr. McGregor was after him in no time, and tried to put his foot upon Peter, who jumped out of a window, upsetting 3 plants. The window was too small for Mr. McGregor, and he was tired of running after Peter. He went back to his work. Peter sat down to rest. He was out of breath and trembling with fright, and he had not the least idea which way to go. Also, he was very damp with sitting in that can. After a time he began to wander about, going lippity-lippity, not very fast, and looking all around. He found a door in a wall, but it was locked, and there was no room for a fat little rabbit to squeeze underneath. An old mouse was running in and out under the stone doorstep, carrying peas and beans to her family in the wood. Peter asked her the way to the gate, but she had such a large pea in her mouth that she could not answer. She only shook her head at him. Peter began to cry. Then he tried to find his way straight across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled. Presently, he came to a pond where Mr. McGregor filled his water cans. A white cat was staring at some goldfish. She sat very, very still, but now and then the tip of her tail twitched as if it were alive. Peter thought it best to go away without speaking to her. He had heard about cats from his cousin, little Benjamin Bunny. He went back towards the tool shed, but suddenly, quite close to him, he heard the noise of a hoe. Scratch, 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 scratch. Peter scuttered underneath the bushes, but presently, as nothing happened, he came out and climbed upon a wheelbarrow and peeped over. The first thing he saw was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions. His back was turned towards Peter, and beyond him was the gate. Peter got down very quietly off the wheelbarrow and started running as fast as he could go along a straight walk behind some black currant bushes. Mr. McGregor caught sight of him at the corner, but Peter did not care. He slipped underneath the gate and was safe at last in the wood outside the garden. Mr. McGregor hung up the little jacket and the shoes for a scarecrow to frighten the blackbirds. Peter never stopped running or looked behind him till he got home to the big fir tree. He was so tired that he flopped down upon the nice, soft sand on the floor of the rabbit hole and shut his eyes. His mother was busy cooking. She wondered what he had done with his clothes. It was the second little jacket and pair of shoes that Peter had lost in a fortnight. I'm sorry to say that Peter was not very well during the evening. His mother put him to bed and made some chamomile tea, and she gave a dose of it to Peter, 1 tablespoonful to be taken at bed. But Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail had bread and milk and blackberries for supper. End of The Tale of Peter Rabbit by Beatrix Potter. Read by Sean Penland. The Tale of Two Bad Mice by Beatrix Potter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Once upon a time, there was a very beautiful doll's house. It was red brick with white windows, and it had real muslin curtains and a front door and a chimney. It belonged to 2 dolls called Lucinda and Jane. At least it belonged to Lucinda, but she never ordered meals. Jane was the cook, but she never did any cooking, because the dinner had been bought ready-made in a box full of shavings. There were 2 red lobsters and a ham, a fish, a pudding, and some pears and oranges. They would not come off the plates, but they were extremely beautiful. One morning, Lucinda and Jane had gone out for a drive in the doll's perambulator. There was no one in the nursery, and it was very quiet. Presently, there was a little scuffling, scratching noise in a corner near the fireplace, where there was a hole under the skirting board. Tom Thumb put out his head for a moment, and then popped it in again. Tom Thumb was a mouse. A minute afterwards, Hunca-Munca, his wife, put her head out too, and when she saw that there was no one in the nursery, she ventured out on the oilcloth under the coal box. The doll's house stood at the other side of the fireplace. Tom Thumb and Hunca-Munca went cautiously across the hearthrug. They pushed the front door. It was not fast. Tom Thumb and Hunca-Munca went upstairs and peeped into the dining room. Then they squeaked with joy. Such a lovely dinner was laid out upon the table. There were 10 spoons, and lead knives and forks, and 2 dolly chairs, all so convenient. Tom Thumb set to work at once to carve the ham. It was a beautiful, shiny yellow, streaked with red. The knife crumpled up and hurt him. He put his finger in his mouth. "It is not boiled enough. It is hard. You have a try, Hunca-Munca." Hunca-Munca stood up in her chair and chopped at the ham with another lead knife. "It's as hard as the ham at the cheesemongers," said Hunca-Munca. The ham broke off the plate with a jerk and rolled under the table. "Let it alone," said Tom Thumb. "Give me some fish, Hunca-Munca." Hunca-Munca tried every tin spoon in turn. The fish was glued to the dish. Then Tom Thumb lost his temper. He put the ham in the middle of the floor and hit it with the tongs and with the shovel. Bang! Bang! Smash! Smash! The ham flew all into pieces, for underneath the shiny paint it was made of nothing but plaster. Then there was no end to the rage and disappointment of Tom Thumb and Hunca Munca. They broke up the pudding, the lobsters, the pears, and the oranges. As the fish would not come off the plate, they put it into the red-hot crinkly paper fire in the kitchen. But it would not burn either. Tom Thumb went up the kitchen chimney and looked out the top. There was no soot. While Tom Thumb was up the chimney, Hunca Munca had another disappointment. She found some tiny canisters upon the dresser, labeled rice, coffee, and sago. But when she turned them upside down, there was nothing inside except red and blue beads. Then those mice set to work to do all the mischief they could, especially Tom Thumb. He took Jane's clothes out of the chest of drawers in her bedroom, and he threw them out the top floor window. But Hunca Munca had a frugal mind. After pulling half the feathers out of Lucinda's bolster, she remembered that she herself was in want of a feather bed. With Tom Thumb's assistance, she carried the bolster downstairs and across the hearth rug. It was difficult to squeeze the bolster into the mouse hole, but they managed it somehow. Then Hunca Munca went back and fetched a chair, a bookcase, a birdcage, and several small odds and ends. The bookcase and the birdcage refused to go into the mouse hole. Hunca Munca left them behind in the coal box and went to fetch a cradle. Hunca Munca was just returning with another chair when suddenly there was a noise of talking outside upon the landing. The mice rushed back to their hole, and the dolls came into the nursery. What a sight met the eyes of Jane and Lucinda. Lucinda sat upon the upset kitchen stove and stared, and Jane leaned against the kitchen dresser and smiled, but neither of them made any remark. The bookcase and the birdcage were rescued from under the coal box, but Hunca Munca had got the cradle and some of Lucinda's clothes. She also had some useful pots and pans and several other things. The little girl that the dollhouse belonged to said, "I'll get a doll dressed like a policeman." But the nurse said, "I'll set a mousetrap." So that is the story of two bad mice. But they weren't so very, very naughty after all, because Tom Thumb paid for everything he broke. He found a crooked sixpence under the hearthrug, and upon Christmas Eve, he and Hunca Munca stuffed it into one of the stockings of Lucinda and Jane. And very early every morning, before anybody is awake, Hunca Munca comes with her dustpan and her broom to sweep the dolly's house. End of The Tale of Two Bad Mice by Beatrix Potter. Read by Sean Penland.
The Tale of Mrs Tiggy-Winkle by Beatrix Potter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Once upon a time, there was a little girl called Lucy who lived at a farm called Littletown. She was a good little girl, only she was always losing her pocket handkerchiefs. One day, little Lucy came into the farmyard crying. Oh, she did cry so. "I've lost my pocket handkin. 3 handkins and a penny. Have you seen them, Tabby Kitten?" The kitten went on washing her white paws, so Lucy asked a speckled hen, "Sally Hennypenny, have you found 3 pocket handkins?" But the speckled hen ran into the barn, clucking, "I go barefoot, barefoot, barefoot." And then Lucy asked Cock Robin, sitting on a twig. Cock Robin looked sideways at Lucy with his bright black eye, and he flew over a stile and away. Lucy climbed upon the stile and looked up the hill behind Littletown, a hill that goes up, up into the clouds as though it had no top. And in a great way up the hillside, she thought she saw some white things spread upon the grass. Lucy scrambled up the hill as fast as her stout legs would carry her. She ran along a steep pathway up and up until Littletown was right away down below. She could have dropped a pebble down the chimney. Presently, she came to a spring bubbling out from the hillside. Someone had stood a tin can upon a stone to catch the water, but the water was already running over, for the can was no bigger than an egg cup, and where the sand upon the path was wet, there were footmarks of a very small person. Lucy ran on and on. The path ended under a big rock. The grass was short and green, and there were clothes, props cut from bracken stems, with lines of plaited rushes and a heap of tiny clothespins, but no pocket handkerchiefs. But there was something else. A door, straight into the hill, and inside it someone was singing. Lily white and clean, oh, with little frills between, oh, smooth and hot, red rusty spot, never here be seen, oh. Lucy knocked, once, twice, and interrupted the song. A frightened voice called out, "Who's that?" Lucy opened the door, and what do you think there was inside the hill? A nice clean kitchen with a flagged floor and wooden beams, just like any other farm kitchen, only the ceiling was so low that Lucy's head nearly touched it, and the pots and pans were small, and so was everything there. There was a nice hot singy smell, and at the table, with an iron in her hand, stood a very stout, short person staring anxiously at Lucy. Her print gown was tucked up, and she was wearing a large apron over her striped petticoat. Her little black nose went sniffle, sniffle, snuffle, and her eyes went twinkle, twinkle, and underneath her cap, where Lucy had yellow curls, that little person had prickles. "Who are you?" said Lucy. "Have you seen my pocket handkins?" The little person made a bob curtsy. "Oh, yes, if you please'm. My name is Mrs. Tiggy-Winkle. Oh, yes, if you please'm. I'm an excellent clear starcher." And she took something out of the clothes basket and spread it on the ironing blanket. "What's that thing?" said Lucy. "That's not my pocket handkin." "Oh, no, if you please'm. That's a little scarlet waistcoat belonging to Cock Robin." And she ironed it and folded it and put it on one side. Then she took something else off the clothes horse. "That isn't my pinny," said Lucy. "Oh, no, if you please'm. That's a damask tablecloth belonging to Jenny Wren. Look how it's stained with currant wine. It's very bad to wash," said Mrs. Tiggy-Winkle. Mrs. Tiggy-Winkle's nose went sniffle, sniffle, snuffle, and her eyes went twinkle, twinkle, and she fetched another hot iron from the fire. "There's one of my pocket handkins," cried Lucy, "and there's my pinny." Mrs. Tiggy-Winkle ironed it, and goffered it, and shook out the frills. "Oh, that is lovely," said Lucy. "And what are those long yellow things with fingers like gloves?" "Oh, that's a pair of stockings belonging to Sally Hennypenny. Look how she's worn the heels out with scratching the yard. She'll very soon go barefoot," said Mrs. Tiggy-Winkle. "Why, there's another handkersniff, but it isn't mine, it's red." "Oh, no, if you please'm, that one belongs to old Mrs. Rabbit, and it did so smell of onions. I had to wash it separately, I can't get out the smell." "There's another one of mine," said Lucy. "What are those funny little white things?" "That's a pair of mittens belonging to Tabby Kitten. I only have to iron them. She washes them herself." "There's my last pocket handkin," said Lucy. "And what are you dipping into the basin of starch?" "They're little dicky shirt fronts belonging to Tom Titmouse. Most terrible particular," said Mrs. Tiggy-Winkle. "Now, I've finished my ironing. I'm going to air some clothes." "What are those dear soft fluffy things?" said Lucy. "Oh, those are the woolly coats belonging to the little lambs at Skelgill." "Will their jackets take off?" asked Lucy. "Oh, yes, if you please'm. Look at the sheep mark on the shoulder, and here's one marked for Gatesgarth, and 3 that come from Littletown. They're always marked at washing," said Mrs. Tiggy-Winkle. And she hung up all sorts and sizes of clothes, small brown coats of mice, and one velvety black moleskin waistcoat, and a red tailcoat with no tail belonging to Squirrel Nutkin, and a very much shrunk blue jacket belonging to Peter Rabbit, and a petticoat, not marked, that had gone lost in the washing, and at last the basket was empty. Then Mrs. Tiggy-Winkle made tea, a cup for herself and a cup for Lucy. They sat before the fire on a bench and looked sideways at one another. Mrs. Tiggy-Winkle's hand, holding the teacup, was very, very brown and very, very wrinkly with the soap suds, and all through her gown and her cap there were hairpins sticking wrong end out, so that Lucy didn't like to sit too near her. When they had finished tea, they tied up the clothes in bundles, and Lucy's pocket handkerchiefs were folded up inside her clean pinny and fastened with a silver safety pin. And then they made up the fire with turf, and came out and locked the door and hid the key under the door-sill. Then away down the hill trotted Lucy and Mrs. Tiggy-Winkle with the bundle of clothes. All the way down the path little animals came out of the fern to meet them. The very first that they met were Peter Rabbit and Benjamin Bunny. And she gave them their nice clean clothes, and all the little animals and birds were so very much obliged to dear Mrs. Tiggy-Winkle, so that at the bottom of the hill, when they came to the stile, there was nothing left to carry except Lucy's one little bundle. Lucy scrambled up the stile with the bundle in her hand, and then she turned to say good night and to thank the washerwoman. But that was a very odd thing. Mrs. Tiggy-Winkle had not waited either for thanks or for the washing bill. She was running up the hill. And where was her white frilled cap, and her shawl, and her gown, and her petticoat? And how small she had grown, and how brown, and covered with prickles. Why, Mrs. Tiggy-Winkle was nothing but a hedgehog. Now some people say that little Lucy had been asleep upon the stile, but then how could she have found 3 clean pocket handkins and a penny pinned with a silver safety pin? And besides, I have seen that door into the back of the hill called Cat Bells. And besides, I am very well acquainted with dear Mrs. Tiggy-Winkle. End of The Tale of Mrs. Tiggy-Winkle by Beatrix Potter. Read by Diane Erdman.
The Story of the 3 Little Pigs by L. Leslie Brooke. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Once upon a time, there was an old sow with 3 little pigs, and as she had not enough to keep them, she sent them out to seek their fortune. The first that went off met a man with a bundle of straw, and said to him, "Please, man, give me that straw to build me a house," which the man did. And the little pig built a house with it. Presently came along a wolf, and knocked at the door and said, Little pig, let me come in." To which the pig answered, "No, no, by the hair of my chinny chin chin." "Then I'll huff, and I'll puff, and I'll blow your house in," said the wolf. So he huffed, and he puffed, and he blew his house in, and ate up the little pig. The second pig met a man with a bundle of furs, and said, "Please, man, give me that furs to build a house," which the man did, and the pig built his house. Then along came the wolf, and said, little pig, let me come in." "No, no, by the hair of my chinny chin chin." "Then I'll puff, and I'll huff, and I'll blow your house in." So he huffed, and he puffed, and he puffed, and then he huffed, and at last he blew the house down, and ate up the second little pig. The third little pig met a man with a load of bricks, and said, "Please, man, give me those bricks to build a house with." So the man gave him the bricks, and he built his house with them. So the wolf came, as he did to the other little pigs, and said, little pig, let me come in." "No, no, by the hair of my chinny chin chin." "Then I'll huff, and I'll puff, and I'll blow your house in." Well, he huffed, and he puffed, and he huffed, and he puffed, and he puffed, and he huffed, but he could not get the house down. When he found that he could not, with all his huffing and puffing, blow the house down, he said, "Little pig, I know where there is a nice field of turnips." "Where?" said the little pig. "Oh, in Mr. Smith's home field, and if you will be ready tomorrow morning, I will call for you, and we will go together and get some for dinner."
Very well, said the little pig. I'll be ready. What time do you mean to go? Oh, at 6 o'clock. Well, the little pig got up at 5, and got the turnips, and was home again before 6. When the wolf came, he said, Little pig, are you ready? Ready, said the little pig. I have been, and come back again, and got a nice pot full for dinner. The wolf felt very angry at this, but thought that he would be up to the pig somehow or other. So he said, Little pig, I know where there is a nice apple tree. Where? Said the little pig. Down at the merry garden, replied the wolf. And if you will not deceive me, I will come for you at 5 o'clock tomorrow, and we will go together and get some apples. Well, the little pig woke at 4 the next morning and bustled up and went off for the apples, hoping to get back before the wolf came. But he had farther to go, and he had to climb the tree, so that just as he was coming down from it, he saw the wolf coming, which, as you may suppose, frightened him very much. When the wolf came up, he said, Little pig, what? Are you here before me? Are they nice apples? Yes, very, said the little pig. I will throw you down one. And he threw it down so far that while the wolf was gone to pick it up, the little pig jumped down and ran home. The next day the wolf came again and said to the little pig, Little pig, there's a fair in town this afternoon. Will you go? Oh, yes, said the pig, I will go. What time shall you be ready? At 3, said the wolf. So the little pig went off before the time, as usual, and got to the fair, and bought a butter churn, and was on his way home with it, when he saw the wolf coming. Then he could not tell what to do, so he got into the churn to hide, and in doing so it turned round, and it began to roll, and rolled down the hill with the pig inside it, which frightened the wolf so much that he ran home without going to the fair. He went to the little pig's house and told him how frightened he had been by the great round thing, which came down the hill past him. Then the little pig said, Ha! I frightened you, did I? I had been to the fair and bought a butter churn, and when I saw you, I got into it and rolled down the hill. Then the wolf was very angry indeed, and declared he would eat up the little pig, and that he would go down the chimney after him. When the little pig saw what he was about, he hung on a pot full of water, and made up a blazing fire, and just as the wolf was coming down, took off the cover of the pot, and in fell the wolf. And the pig put on the cover, and in an instant boiled him up, and ate him for supper, and lived happily ever after. End of The Story of the Three Little Pigs by L. Leslie Brooke, read by Natasha Roblin.
Uncle Wiggily is Snowballed by Fox and Wolf by Howard Roger Garris. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Once upon a time, Uncle Wiggily was out walking wearing his tall silk hat, for he had been to a reception given by Mrs. Twistytail, the pig lady. Then all of a sudden, when Uncle Wiggily was nearly at his hollow stump bungalow, the fox threw a snowball, knocking off his hat. "Ha ha!" laughed the wolf. "That's funny." Uncle Wiggily could see nothing very funny about it. "Guess I'll run," he said. Uncle Wiggily guessed what sort of trick the fox and wolf were trying to play on him. "They thought I'd stop and pick up my hat," said the bunny to himself, "and then they could catch me and nibble my ears. But I'd rather lose my hat than my ears." So away he ran without his hat. Out jumped the fox and wolf. One of them picked up the hat and chased after Uncle Wiggily with it, crying, "Wait!" Uncle Wiggily ran so fast without his hat that soon he left the fox and wolf behind. "Well, our trick didn't work," said Fox. "No," agreed the wolf, "but I know another trick we can play." The fox wanted to know what it was. "We'll do this," growled the wolf. "We'll sneak up and leave Uncle Wiggily's hat near his bungalow. Then we'll hide, and when he comes out to get it, we'll grab him." Uncle Wiggily ran on as fast as he could without his hat, until he reached his hollow stump bungalow. Near it, he saw some of the animal boys having a snowball fight. "Oh, this gives me an idea for playing a trick on Fox and Wolf," said the bunny. Just then, up rushed Floppy Twistytail, the piggy boy. He had heard what the fox and wolf said about coming to the bungalow, and Floppy told all. "You say the fox and wolf are coming to put my hat on the ground near my bungalow, and will grab me when I go to get it? Is that it, Floppy?" asked the bunny. "That's it," said the piggy boy. "Ah, now for a snowball fight," cried Uncle Wiggily to the animal boys. "Make all the hard balls you can," he told them. "Hide around the corner of my bungalow, and we'll wait for the fox and wolf to come." Along came Fox and Wolf, not knowing what was going to happen to them. Around the corner of the bungalow, Uncle Wiggily and the animal boys watched. "We'll leave the hat on the snow," said the fox to the wolf. "I guess Uncle Wiggily is in there now. Then we'll hide behind the stump and wait for him to come out to get his hat." The wolf said that would be a good plan, so that's what they did. "Now, boys, be on the watch," whispered Uncle Wiggily to the animal chaps with their hard snowballs. "I'm going out now to get my hat. When the fox and wolf rush at me, well, you know what to do." The animal boys chuckled with glee. "Yes, we know what to do, all right, Uncle Wiggily," his pink nose twinkling at what was going to happen. Uncle Wiggily stepped bravely toward the hat. All of a sudden, just as Uncle Wiggily reached down and picked up his hat, all of a sudden out rushed the fox and wolf from behind the stump. "Now we'll get him," howled the wolf. "Let them have the snowballs, fellows," cried the piggy boy, and they threw the hard chunks of snow and ice in the faces of the fox and wolf. "Oh, wow, what is this?" barked the fox, as he felt a snowball hit him on his ear. "Give it to them, boys, give it to them," cried Uncle Wiggily. The bunny rabbit put his hat down over his ears so it wouldn't fall off, and then he, too, joined in the snowball fight. "I thought you said we could easily get Uncle Wiggily," howled the wolf to the fox. "Well, I thought we could," cried the fox. "Oh, wow, what a mistake we made. Never again will I throw at Uncle Wiggily's hat." End of Uncle Wiggily is Snowballed by Fox and Wolf by Howard Roger Garris. Read by Tom Merritt. The Unmannerly Tiger by William Elliott Griffiths. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mountain Uncle was the name given by the villagers to a splendid striped tiger that lived among the highlands of Kang Wen, the long province which from its cliffs overlooks the Sea of Japan. Hunters rarely saw him, and among his fellow tigers, the Mountain Uncle boasted that, though often fired at, he had never been wounded. While as for traps, he knew all about them, and laughed at the devices used by man to catch him and to strip him of his coveted skin. In summer he kept among the high hills and lived on fat deer. In winter, when heavy snow, biting winds, and terrible cold kept human beings within doors, old Mountain Uncle would sally forth to the villages. There he would prowl around the stables, the cattle enclosures, or the pig pens, in hopes of clawing and dragging out a young donkey, a fat calf, or suckling pig. Too often he succeeded, so that he was the terror of the country for leagues around. One day in autumn, Mountain Uncle was rambling among the lower hills. Though far from any village, he kept a sharp lookout for traps and hunters, but none seemed to be near. He was very hungry and hoped for game. But on coming round a great rock, Mountain Uncle suddenly saw in the path some feet ahead, as he thought, a big tiger like himself. He stopped, twitched his tail most ferociously, as a challenge, showed fight by growling, and got ready to spring. What was his surprise to see the other tiger doing exactly the same things. Mountain Uncle was sure there would be a terrible struggle, but this was just what he wanted, or he expected to win. But after a tremendous leap in the air, he landed in a pit, and all of a heap, bruised and disappointed. There was no tiger to be seen, but instead a heavy lid of logs had closed over his head with a crash, and he lay in darkness. Old Mountain Uncle was caught at last. Yes, the hunter had concealed the pit with sticks and leaves, and on the upright timbers, covered with vines and brushwood, had hung a looking-glass. Mountain Uncle had often beheld his own face and body in the water when he stooped to drink, but this time, not seeing any water, he was deceived into thinking a real tiger wanted to fight him. By and by a Buddhist priest came along who believed in being kind to all living creatures. Hearing an animal moaning, he opened the trap and, lifting the lid, saw old Mountain Uncle at the bottom, licking his bruised paw. "Oh, please, Mr. Man, let me out. I'm hurt badly," said the tiger. Thereupon the priest lifted up one of the logs and slid it down until it rested on the bottom of the pit. Then the tiger climbed up and out. Old Mountain Uncle expressed his thanks volubly, saying to the shaven head, "I am deeply grateful to you, sir, for helping me out of my trouble. Nevertheless, as I am very hungry, I must eat you up." The priest, very much surprised and indignant, protested against such vile ingratitude. To say the least, it was very bad manners, and entirely against the law of the mountains, and he appealed to a big tree to decide between them. The spirit in the tree spoke through the rustling leaves, and declared that the man should go free, and that the tiger was both ungrateful and unmannerly. Old Mountain Uncle was not satisfied yet, especially as the priest was unusually fat and would make a very good dinner. However, he allowed the man to appeal once more, and this time to a big rock. "The man is certainly right, venerable Mountain Uncle, and you are wholly wrong," said the spirit in the rock. "Your master, the mountain spirit, who rides on the green bull and the piebald horse to punish his enemies, will certainly chastise you if you devour this priest. You will be no fit messenger of the mountain lord if you are so ungrateful as to eat the man who saved you from starvation or death in the trap. It is shockingly bad manners, even to think of such a thing." The tiger felt ashamed, but his eyes still glared with hunger. So to be sure of saving his own skin, the priest proposed to make the toad a judge. The tiger agreed. But the toad, with his gold-rimmed eyes, looked very wise, and instead of answering quickly as the tree and rock did, deliberated a long time. The priest's heart sank while the tiger moved his jaws, as if anticipating his feast. He felt sure that old Speckleback would decide in his favor. "I must go and see the trap before I can make up my mind," said the toad, who looked as solemn as a magistrate. So all three leaped, hopped, or walked to the trap. The tiger, moving fast, was there first, which was just what the toad, who was a friend of the priest, wanted. Besides, old Speckleback was diligently looking for a crack in the rocks nearby. So while the toad and the tiger were studying the matter, the priest ran off and saved himself within the monastery gates. When at last old Speckleback decided against Mountain Uncle and in favor of the man, he had no sooner finished his judgment than he hopped into the rock crevice and, crawling far inside, defied the tiger, calling him an unmannerly brute and an ungrateful beast, and daring him to do his worst. Old Mountain Uncle was so mad with rage and hunger that his craftiness seemed turned into stupidity. He clawed at the rock to get at the toad, but Speckleback, safe within, only laughed. Unable to do any harm, the tiger flew into a passion of rage. The hotter his temper grew, the more he lost his wit. Poking his nose inside the crack, he rubbed it so hard on the rough rock that he soon bled to death. When the hunter came along, he marveled at what he saw, but he was glad to get rich by selling the tiger's fur, bones, and claws, for in Korea nothing sells so well as a tiger. As for the toad, he told to several generations of his descendants the story of how he outwitted the old Mountain Uncle. And of the Unmannerly Tiger by William Elliott Griffiths. Read by Tom Merritt.
The Velveteen Rabbit, or How Toys Become Real by Marjorie Williams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. There once was a Velveteen Rabbit. In the beginning he was really splendid. He was fat and bunchy, as a rabbit should be. His coat was spotted brown and white, he had real thread whiskers, and his ears were lined with pink sateen. On Christmas morning, when he sat wedged on the top of the boy's stocking with a sprig of holly between his paws, the effect was charming. There were other things in the stocking, nuts and oranges and a toy engine, and chocolate almonds and a clockwork mouse, but the rabbit was quite the best of all. For at least 2 hours the boy loved him, and then aunts and uncles came to dinner, and there was a great rustling of tissue paper and unwrapping of parcels, and in the excitement of looking at all the new presents, the Velveteen Rabbit was forgotten. For a long time he lived in the toy cupboard or on the nursery floor, and no one thought very much about him. He was naturally shy, and being only made of velveteen, some of the more expensive toys quite snubbed him. The mechanical toys were very superior, and looked down upon everyone else. They were full of modern ideas, and pretended they were real. The model boat, who lived through 2 seasons and lost most of his paint, caught the tone from them and never missed an opportunity of referring to his rigging in technical terms. The rabbit could not claim to be a model of anything, for he didn't know that real rabbits existed. He thought they were all stuffed with sawdust, like himself, and he understood that sawdust was quite out of date and should never be mentioned in modern circles. Even Timothy, the jointed wooden lion, who was made by the disabled soldiers and should have had broader views, put on airs and pretended he was connected with the government. Between them all, the poor little rabbit was made to feel himself very insignificant and commonplace, and the only person who was kind to him at all was the Skin Horse. The Skin Horse had lived longer in the nursery than any of the others. He was so old that his brown coat was bald in patches and showed the seams underneath, and most of the hairs in his tail had been pulled out to string bead necklaces. He was wise, for he had seen a long succession of mechanical toys arrive to boast and swagger, and by break their mainsprings and pass away, and he knew that they were only toys and would never turn into anything else. For nursery magic is very strange and wonderful, and only those playthings that are old and wise and experienced like the Skin Horse understand all about it. "What is real?" asked the rabbit one day when they were lying side by side near the nursery fender before Nana came to tidy the room. "Does it mean having things that buzz inside you and a stick-out handle?" "Real isn't how you were made," said the Skin Horse. "It's a thing that happens to you. When a child loves you for a long, long time, not just to play with, but really loves you, then you become real." "Does it hurt?" asked the rabbit. "Sometimes," said the Skin Horse, for he was always truthful. "When you are real, you don't mind being hurt." "Does it happen all at once, like being wound up?" he asked, "or bit by bit?" "It doesn't happen all at once," said the Skin Horse. "You become. It takes a long time. That's why it doesn't happen often to people who break easily, or have sharp edges, or who have to be carefully kept. Generally, by the time you are real, most of your hair has been loved off, and your eyes drop out, and you get loose in the joints and very shabby. But these things don't matter at all, because once you are real, you can't be ugly, except to people who don't understand." "I suppose you are real," said the rabbit, and then he wished he had not said it, for he thought the Skin Horse might be sensitive. but the Skin Horse only smiled. "The boy's uncle made me real," he said. "That was a great many years ago, but once you are real, you can't become unreal again. It lasts for always." The rabbit sighed. He thought it would be a long time before this magic called real happened to him. He longed to become real, to know what it felt like, and yet the idea of growing shabby and losing his eyes and whiskers was rather sad. He wished that he could become it without these uncomfortable things happening to him. There was a person called Nana who ruled the nursery. Sometimes she took no notice of the playthings lying about, and sometimes, for no reason whatsoever, she went swooping about like a great wind and hustled them away in cupboards. She called this tidying up, and the playthings all hated it, especially the tin ones. The rabbit didn't mind it so much, for wherever he was thrown, he came down soft. One evening, when the boy was going to bed, he couldn't find the china dog that always slept with him. Nana was in a hurry, and it was too much trouble to hunt for china dogs at bedtime, so she simply looked about her, and seeing that the toy cupboard door stood open, she made a swoop. "Here," she said, "take your old bunny. He'll do to sleep with you." And she dragged the rabbit out by one ear and put him into the boy's arms. That night, and for many nights after, the Velveteen Rabbit slept in the boy's bed. At first he found it rather uncomfortable, for the boy hugged him very tight, and sometimes he rolled over on him. Sometimes he pushed him so far under the pillow that the rabbit could scarcely breathe. And he missed, too, those long moonlight hours in the nursery, when all the house was silent and his talks with the Skin Horse. But very soon he grew to like it, for the boy used to talk to him, and made nice tunnels for him under the bedclothes that he said were like the burrows the real rabbits lived in. And they had splendid games together, in whispers, when Nana had gone away to her supper and left the nightlight burning on the mantelpiece. And when the boy dropped off to sleep, the rabbit would snuggle down close under his little warm chin and dream, with the boy's hands clasped close round him all night long. And so time went on, and the little rabbit was very happy, so happy that he never noticed how his beautiful velveteen fur was getting shabbier and shabbier, and his tail becoming unsewn, and all the pink rubbed off his nose where the boy had kissed him. Spring came, and they had long days in the garden, for wherever the boy went, the rabbit went too. He had rides in the wheelbarrow, and picnics on the grass, and lovely fairy huts built for him under the raspberry canes behind the flower border. And once, when the boy was called away suddenly to go out to tea, the rabbit was left out on the lawn till long after dusk, and Nana had to come and look for him with the candle because the boy couldn't go to sleep unless he was there. He was wet through with the dew and quite earthy from diving into the burrows the boy had made for him in the flower bed, and Nana grumbled as she rubbed him off with a corner of her apron. "You must have your old bunny," she said. "Fancy all that fuss for a toy." The boy sat up in bed and stretched out his hands. "Give me my bunny," he said. "You mustn't say that. He isn't a toy. He's real." When the little rabbit heard that, he was happy, for he knew that what the Skin Horse had said was true at last. The nursery magic had happened to him, and he was a toy no longer. He was real. The boy himself had said it. That night he was almost too happy to sleep, and so much love stirred in his little sawdust heart that it almost burst, and into his boot-button eyes that had long ago lost their polish there came a look of wisdom and beauty, so that even Nana noticed it next morning when she picked him up and said, "I declare that old bunny hasn't got quite a knowing expression." That was a wonderful summer. Near the house where they lived there was a wood, and in the long June evenings the boy liked to go there after tea to play. He took the Velveteen Rabbit with him, and before he wandered off to pick flowers or play at brigands among the trees, he always made the rabbit a little nest somewhere among the bracken, where he would be quite cozy, for he was a kind-hearted little boy, and he liked Bunny to be comfortable. One evening, while the rabbit was lying there alone, watching the ants that ran to and fro between his velvet paws in the grass, he saw two strange beings creep out of the tall bracken near him. They were rabbits like himself, but quite furry and brand new. They must have been very well made, for their seams didn't show at all, and they changed shape in a queer way when they moved. One minute they were long and thin, and the next minute fat and bunchy, instead of always staying the same like he did. Their feet patted softly on the ground, and they crept quite close to him, twitching their noses, while the rabbit stared hard to see which side the clockwork stuck out, for he knew that people who jumped gently was something to wind them up. But he couldn't see it. They were evidently a new kind of rabbit altogether. They stared at him, and the little rabbit stared back, and all the time the noses twitched. "Why don't you get up and play with us?" one of them asked. "I don't feel like it," said the rabbit, for he didn't want to explain that he had no clockwork. "Ho!" said the furry rabbit. "It's as easy as anything," and he gave a big hop sideways and stood on his hind legs. "I don't believe you can," he said. "I can," said the little rabbit. "I can jump higher than anything." He meant when the boy threw him, but of course he didn't want to say so. "Can you hop on your hind legs?" asked the furry rabbit. That was a dreadful question, for the Velveteen Rabbit had no hind legs at all. The back of him was made all in one piece like a pincushion. He sat still in the bracken and hoped that the other rabbits wouldn't notice. "I don't want to," he said again. But the wild rabbits have very sharp eyes, and this one stretched out his neck and looked. "He hasn't got any hind legs," he called out. "Fancy a rabbit without any hind legs." And he began to laugh. "I have," cried the little rabbit. "I've got hind legs. I'm sitting on them." "Then stretch them out and show me, like this," said the wild rabbit, and he began to whirl around and dance till the little rabbit got quite dizzy. "I don't like dancing," he said. "I'd rather sit still." But all the while he was longing to dance, for a funny new tickly feeling ran through him, and he felt he would give anything in the world to be able to jump about like these rabbits did. The strange rabbit stopped dancing and came quite close. He came so close this time that his long whiskers brushed the Velveteen Rabbit's ear, and then he wrinkled his nose suddenly and flattened his ears and jumped backwards. "He doesn't smell right," he exclaimed. "He isn't a rabbit at all. He isn't real." "I am real," said the little rabbit. "I am real. The boy said so." And he nearly began to cry. Just then there was a sound of footsteps, and the boy ran past near them. With a stamp of feet, a flash of white tails, the two strange rabbits disappeared. "Come back and play with me," called the little rabbit. "Oh, do come back. I know I'm real." But there was no answer. Only the little ants ran to and fro, and the bracken swayed gently where the two strangers had passed. The Velveteen Rabbit was all alone. "Oh, dear," he thought. "Why'd they run away like that? Why couldn't they stop and talk to me?" For a long time he lay very still, watching the bracken and hoping that they would come back. But they never returned, and presently the sun sank lower and the little white moths fluttered out, and the boy came and carried him home. Weeks passed, and the little rabbit grew very old and shabby, but the boy loved him just as much. He loved him so hard that he loved all his whiskers off, and the pink lining to his ears turned gray, and his brown spots faded. He even began to lose his shape, and he scarcely looked like a rabbit any more, except to the boy. To him he was always beautiful, and that was all that the little rabbit cared about. He didn't mind how he looked to other people, because the nursery magic had made him real, and when you are real, shabbiness doesn't matter. And then, one day, the boy was ill. His face grew very flushed, and he talked in his sleep, and his little body was so hot that it burned the rabbit when he held him close. Strange people came and went in the nursery, and a light burned all night, and through it all the little Velveteen Rabbit lay there, hidden from sight under the bedclothes. And he never stirred, for he was afraid that if they found him someone might take him away, and he knew that the boy needed him. It was a long, weary time, for the boy was too ill to play, and the little rabbit found it rather dull with nothing to do all day long. But he snuggled down patiently, and he looked forward to the time when the boy should be well again, and they would go out in the garden amongst the flowers and the butterflies and play splendid games in the raspberry thicket like they used to. All sorts of delightful things he planned. While the boy lay half asleep, he crept up close to the pillow and whispered them in his ear, and presently the fever turned, and the boy got better. He was able to sit up in bed and look at picture books, with the little rabbit cuddled close at his side. And then one day, they let him get up and dress. It was a bright, sunny morning, and the window stood wide open. They had carried the boy out onto the balcony, wrapped in a shawl, and the little rabbit lay tangled up among the bedclothes, thinking. The boy was going to the seaside tomorrow. Everything was arranged, and now it only remained to carry out the doctor's orders. They talked about it all, while the little rabbit lay under the bedclothes, just his head peeping out, and listened. The room must be disinfected, and all the books and toys that the boy had played with in bed must be burnt. "Hurrah!" thought the little rabbit. "Tomorrow we shall go to the seaside." For the boy had often talked of the seaside, and he wanted very much to see the big waves coming in, and the tiny crabs and the sand castles. Just then Nana caught sight of him. "How about his old bunny?" she asked. "That?" said the doctor. "Why, it's a mess of scarlet fever germs. Burn it at once." "What? Nonsense. Get him a new one. He mustn't have that any more." And so the little rabbit was put into a sack with the old picture books and a lot of rubbish, and carried out to the end of the garden behind the fowl house. That was a fine place to make a bonfire, only the gardener was too busy just then to attend to it. He had the potatoes to dig and the green peas to gather, but next morning he promised to come quite early and burn the whole lot. That night the boy slept in a different bedroom, and he had a new bunny to sleep with him. It was a splendid bunny, all white plush with real glass eyes, but the boy was too excited to care very much about it, for tomorrow he was going to the seaside, and that in itself was such a wonderful thing that he could think of nothing else. And while the boy was asleep, dreaming of the seaside, Little Rabbit lay among the old picture books in the corner behind the fowl house, and he felt very lonely. The sack had been left untied, and so by wriggling a bit he was able to get his head through the opening and look out. He was shivering a little, for he had always been used to sleeping in a proper bed, and by this time his coat had worn so thin and threadbare from hugging there was no longer any protection to him. Nearby he could see the thicket of raspberry canes, growing tall and close like a tropical jungle, in whose shadow he had played with the boy on bygone mornings. He thought of those long sunlit hours in the garden, how happy they were, and a great sadness came over him. He seemed to see them all pass before him, each more beautiful than the other, the fairy huts in the flower bed, the quiet evenings in the wood when he lay in the bracken and the little ants went over his paws, the wonderful day when he first knew that he was real. He thought of the skin horse, so wise and gentle, and all that he had told him. Of what use was it to be loved and lose one's beauty and become real if it all ended like this? And a tear, a real tear, trickled down his little shabby velvet nose and fell to the ground. And then a strange thing happened, for where the tear had fallen a flower grew out of the ground, a mysterious flower, not at all like any that grew in the garden. It had slender green leaves, the color of emeralds, and in the center of the leaves a blossom like a golden cup. It was so beautiful that the little rabbit forgot to cry, and just lay there watching it. And presently the blossom opened, and out of it there stepped a fairy. She was quite the loveliest fairy in the whole world. Her dress was of pearl and dewdrops, and there were flowers round her neck and in her hair, and her face was like the most perfect flower of all. And she came close to the little rabbit and gathered him up in her arms and kissed him on his velveteen nose that was all damp from crying. "Little rabbit," she said, "don't you know who I am?" The rabbit looked up at her, and it seemed to him that he had seen her face before, but couldn't think where. "I am the nursery magic fairy," she said. "I take care of all the playthings that the children have loved. When they are old and worn out and the children don't need them any more, then I come and take them away with me and turn them into real." "Wasn't I real before?" asked the little rabbit. "You were real to the boy," the fairy said, "because he loved you. Now you shall be real to everyone." And she held the little rabbit close in her arms and flew with him into the wood. It was light now, for the moon had risen. All the forest was beautiful, and the fronds of the bracken shone like frosted silver. In the open glade between the tree trunks the wild rabbits danced with their shadows on the velvet grass. But when they saw the fairy, they all stopped dancing and stood round in a ring to stare at her. "I've brought you a new playfellow," the fairy said. "You must be very kind to him and teach him all he needs to know in Rabbitland, for he is going to live with you forever and ever." And she kissed the little rabbit again and put him down on the grass. "Run and play, little rabbit," she said. But the little rabbit sat quite still for a moment and never moved, for when he saw all the wild rabbits dancing round him, he suddenly remembered about his hind legs, and he didn't want them to see that he was made all in one piece. He did not know that when the fairy kissed him that last time, she had changed him altogether, and he might have sat there a long time, too shy to move, if just then something hadn't tickled his nose, and before he thought what he was doing, he lifted his hind toe to scratch it. And he found that he actually had hind legs. Instead of dingy velveteen, he had brown fur, soft and shiny. His ears twitched by themselves, and his whiskers were so long that they brushed the grass. He gave one leap, and the joy of using those hind legs was so great that he went springing about the turf on them, jumping sideways and whirling round as the others did, and he grew so excited that when he at last did stop to look for the fairy, she had gone. He was a real rabbit at last, at home with the other rabbits. Autumn passed and winter, and in the spring, when the days grew warm and sunny, the boy went out to play in the wood behind the house, and while he was playing, 2 rabbits crept out from the bracken and peeped at him. One of them was brown all over, but the fur had strange markings under his fur, as though long ago he had been spotted, and the spots still showed through, and about his little soft nose and his round black eyes there was something familiar, so that the boy thought to himself, "Why, he looks just like my old bunny that was lost when I had scarlet fever." But he never knew there really was his own bunny, come back to look at the child who had first helped him to be real. End of The Velveteen Rabbit, or How Toys Become Real, by Marjorie Williams. Narrated by Aaron Sproul.